We'll make a start on this. Thanks for finding this room in the far corners of Senate House. Really good to see you all. And this little session really is to help me develop my ideas. I'll be completely frank about that, but perhaps as to not just anticipation, but how do we, there's a space there, there's a space there, there's a space there.
There is another
one. Is there another space?
There's one more, there's one.
Yeah, there's a space there, one there. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, room for more. Right, I see this works. Switch on. Great. So, very short inputs from this illustrious panel about their take on responsibility in futures. And then I think there's a discussion, and let's see where it goes next. So that's the simple plan. As you recall, there are key themes of the conference, which we maybe will refer back to in terms of how we keep it open, how it gets made, the governance of futures, all the things related to responsibility. So the agenda starts with Marku, an age of responsibility. This is something that he's had ideas about for 10 years or more, I seem to recall. I'll say something about values in anticipation. Bruce might talk something about unintended consequences and the notion of the ability to do that, real kind of anticipatory power in social justice, and Roberto, is responsibility possible? So that's going to take a while, but that will, because they're all going to be short, leave us with time. And then we'll discuss these kinds of questions. How is responsible anticipation framed? I'll come back to that. Right now, though, let's get going with Marku, if I can find his presentation. Do you want to use this?
Yeah.
How do you go?
All right. Yeah. Well, we try to keep it like 5 minutes or even less. It's hard. That's why I actually put some of the slides together just to keep the structure. You know what otherwise happens with academics. It's hopeless.
No.
Mostly hopeless. So. As Ted said, I've been wrestling with this responsibility thing for quite a while, and preparing for this seminar, I sort of try to pinpoint what's to me this relationship between responsibility and responsivelessness and anticipation. And it first sort of occurs very much that, well, because the scene that we're seeing is a transformation itself. So, which challenges it is a very different way. So, if we think that, that the hardest of the transformation we are observing, and this is just one of those observations, is certainly what's happening with the climate, but I took that as an example. So if you go into over 2 degrees, like, one sort of transformation that we need to take into our anticipatory systems when we're making the relationship between us and the future. But the same applies, of course, if we go under, because if we go under this 1.5 or 2 degree scenario, then that also imposes us a totally new way of seeing our challenges and our opportunities as of now. So the fundamental is that the transformation is there. Our view to this, which is a kind of a medium, as Ted is imposing on the role of anticipation, the kind of a mediator and forwarder from here to the future. Now the other thing is that what does this responsibility or being responsible imposes is obviously this issue of criticality and reassessment. And this is not something that we never very much prepare, because the society actually would like to see this more as a gradual development continuing to a better or to the worse. But this radical reassessment is something that we are facing when we are assessing this walking into unknown future. And then the third, actually to explain that a little bit more, means that where the complexity comes in, the complexity comes in there where we see that there is a certain mismatch between our assumptions about the future as we take it for the present and our capabilities to understand the complexity of that. So there is this kind of what I call the complexity mismatch there, which is increasing as we move forward. And that is also a fundamental part of our challenge to understand what is the type of anticipatory mechanism we need to utilize in our connection between the now and the future. And then the third point I want to make is that we need to understand also what does it take from us in terms of what I call the fundamental uncertainties. So to accept these uncertainties and to live those uncertainties, even to say to thrive on those uncertainties, is something that is asked from us. But again, it's against our intuition, it's against our standard way of doing things. And that's why it asks us to do something that we don't normally do. Live with fundamental uncertainties. I'm talking about fundamental, not just any type of uncertainty. So those are the basic three kind of issues I wanted to bring into this discussion. And now I'm over my time, so I need to better stop and let the others talk. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lars. Check what the first one was. All right, dealing with open doors at that point. Oh, there's time horizons. Okay, fine. But also scale, I think, is changing as well.
Scale is changing as well.
So next up, maybe me. Yeah. I haven't figured out how to use this. That's it. Okay, so my contribution to this is just to think about how values, responsibility values, are inherent in anticipation, and how does anticipation affect change in values. The connection between anticipation is a kind of idea. The connection between anticipation and norms is that anticipation has causal power to change social norms. Social norms have causal power in reframing and framing anticipation. There's interplay. They're part of the same process. Robert Rosen, whose work informs early work on anticipation, was quite clear that his idea of an anticipatory system the model has an ethical character because it's making evaluations, it's making judgments on whether to act and how to act. So the model's embodied comprises individuality and therefore has an ethical character. The idea of the relationship between the agent, the anticipatory agent, and its environment is a set of modeling relations. That's the concept in use. And that synthesizes entailments in the natural system by inferential entailments in the formal system. model. That's the model. So the relational model is a set of inferential entailments. So we are made this doesn't shine on one of these TV, it absorbs, it sucks in all the light. I need a long stick at this point, or possibly an arm. But anyway, in our formal kind of anticipatory system, we're making inferences, we're making judgments about what's going on out there. We're trying to model that. And that's kind of his theory of how it all works. And therefore, my idea is that value, judgments, and therefore responsibility is inherent in that process. This simple little diagram here tries to portray social emergence, the emergence in social structures. Keith Sawyer's model in his book on emergence paradigm, and what it points to is that individual activities and social structures are somehow connected, and we well know that's a source of continued debate in social theory. But in the centre of that are emergent properties which are quite ephemeral, may or may not destabilise and become social structure. That's the theory between it. So just kind of, you've got this in mind about emergence. So causation is micro-interactional. You've got theories such as relational morphogenesis, various theories about causation and emergence. I won't go through all of these, really, but just to say that there's this kind of the formation of social structure depends on this mutual commitment to endorse and enforce the practices concerned. So the way that social values are developed involves complicity by the norm group. Within prospection theory, Seligman, etc., morality and social norms, as with laws and technology, add structure to the future, making otherwise unavailable actions and outcomes possible. To take action because we like the idea of what the action might yield. A product of collective imagination and argument. The group imagines it together. This is coming from Relt and Bolnis, but Seligman, this whole kind of psychological, positive psychology and prospection futures. So again, morality, social norms, responsibility is inherent in the process. The causal forces imply the idea of future benefits or costs which regulates and motivates action. So anticipation is some kind of causal mechanism in that process, and that judgments are based on values or power, not necessarily always on value. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, the contribution to the discussion on responsibility that's inherent in the process of anticipating that values are inherent and they can be changed and shaped. And emergent norms can be stabilised by the actions, existing norms can be maintained, so the individual action in response to proposed changes or emergent changes make the difference. Okay, what's taken as desirable or undesirable motivates anticipatory action? The relationship between anticipation and norms is not a passive relationship, more necessarily a natural one. Not necessarily a natural relationship, there's a lot of politics or a lot of power play in those processes. Imprediictivity, that's how you pronounce it, is to be avoided. That's the kind of the movement, the gap between the model we have of the world and the reality of the world. That's to be avoided for obvious reasons. Fake news, okay. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bruce Todd. I won't take any questions about Trump right now, but maybe later. So Ted asked me to address this question. Is it possible to identify possible unintended consequences for actions and events? And I have to say yes, otherwise I wouldn't be here. So I do think it's possible. First, I want to tell you, I want to distinguish between anticipated unintended consequences and unanticipated unintended consequences. So for example, with respect to antibiotics, people did anticipate that there would be a reaction to people using antibiotics that might be ineffective. What was unanticipated was the widespread use of antibiotics in the agricultural sector and in hospitals and so on. So it really speeded up the process of making them effective. I also want to say that my focus is from a science and technology background. I used to work at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is a major U.S. Department of Energy research center. So I tend to think about big topics such as particle accelerators and nuclear waste and CRISPR technology and things like that. So is it possible to approach the topic of unintended consequences? And I say yes, there could be some methods we could use. Exploring the use of 4 different types of scenarios. One I call an evolutionary scenario. So if you think of applying that to automobiles over time. Could you imagine how automobiles started off back in the early 1900s and then evolved to where they came today, and that there were certain waypoints along that way. Certainly in the United States, where we could say, well, if we don't develop the interstate highway system, maybe we can keep development within the cities and avoid sprawl and things like that. Of course, we never did that, and things just progressed as they have in the United States, and so we have all kinds of problems with respect to sprawl, fragmented land use, use of too many emissions, and so on and so forth. So that's one possible way of using an evolutionary scenario. The second might be a market saturation scenario. So you think back about televisions. So in the United States, 98% of homes have televisions, and one of the unintended consequences of televisions, at least according to sociologist Robert Putnam, is the decline of social capital. So people are in their homes watching TV, not interacting with people, combining that with sprawl, and you've lost of great good places, and you've lost community. And so that would only happen if everybody has televisions. If only 10% of people have televisions, you wouldn't have lost this social capital, for example. A third way would be a network failure scenario, or a tightly coupled system. An example there is Mao's campaign against sparrows. So we're going to get rid of sparrows so we can increase agricultural production. And so they got, everybody said, oh yeah, we'll go and kill all the sparrows. And then the insects thrived and crops withered. So it was unintended consequence. But what it was in a very tightly coupled system. It went in the system, altered a node, and things went haywire from there. The last, I'd say, is an extinction scenario. So is it possible that this event or technology that you're thinking about can actually result in the unintended extinction of humanity? So my daughter studies environmental policy. She suggested maybe monoculture is one of those things. So the intended consequence of monoculture is to increase agricultural productivity, feed the masses, and so on. But now there's this huge risk to a cascading set of viruses and other plagues that could go through our monocultural system and this unintended consequence of that. So I think you can always practice and go back and find all kinds of technologies and science to practice these types of 4 scenarios, and then move forward to say, addressing things like drones or memory-enhancing technologies or geoengineering to explore the unintended consequences of these events and technologies. Second way is, can you build an academic model, an abstract model, where you can characterize the event, the intended event and the intended consequences, and then as a function of the unintended consequences. So if you can characterize the event in a way, is it an economic event, is it a technology, and so on, the unintended consequences could be characterized as the impact in the economic sector, political sector, society, the environment, and technology. If you can build a model like that, then maybe you can get to understand what the magnitudes of the unintended consequences could be in some kind of generic sense in these different sectors of society. So then the question is, if you did all that, what difference does it make? We heard about progress, and how can we decide not to do something because that's anti-progress? And that's true. I mean, it'd be very hard if you look back over time. If we could imagine what would happen with automobiles, we'd say, "No, we don't want to have automobiles." Or imagine what would happen with televisions or light bulbs, and say, "Well, we wouldn't want those technologies." It's really hard to say that, but we did learn a lot. But maybe what we want to say, in very few cases, no, we don't want to do that. Maybe with respect to geoengineering, because the unintended consequences could be so disastrous for geoengineering. But on the other hand, you might say, well, maybe what we really want to know is what are the operations and maintenance costs of this technology? So you think about what regulations would we need if our society were completely saturated with drones flying overhead and so on. Okay, well now we need to, society needs to set aside 5% of its GDP in order to deal with all of the unintended consequences of these things we really want to have. If we did that, then maybe we'd be prepared to respond to these unintended consequences rather than trying to fit them in or ignore them. So, those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay. Plausible unintended consequences are possible, and that's things to consider, and sort of counterfactual thinking. With counterfactual thinking, it made me wonder about Thomas Edison. Would he have got the light bulb joke? I don't know. Real. In the context of human development, how can anticipatory power effectively enhance social justice?
Thank you, Ted. Power applied to something can have all sorts of intended and unintended consequences. So what is this power we're talking about? Anticipatory power. And this debate's already started, I think, or it's been ongoing and continues to be part of the picture. Let me say that my point of departure for this is the would I want to have a way of knowing how never to die? I'd have a mechanism, a system, the power of the anticipatory mechanism would be so tremendous that I would know how to be immortal. Wow, okay. Do I want to live that way? Is that the way I think of life? That's a choice. But it seems to me that that issue takes us away from, in a very important way, the actual issue of social responsibility, social and morality. Because I would want to make the case that intended or unintended, anticipated or not anticipated, the critical question is, do I act morally in the present with respect to the possibilities that I see in the present? And that, in some senses, this is an illusion, the future, and anticipation. But it's a useful illusion, obviously. And the question is how we use it. And if we use it for somehow constructing the castle or the system of drones that will never, threaten us, or the light bulb that will never induce us into building cities or whatever. I mean, it seems to me that that's trying to cast our position, our role in the role of gods. And this question of not colonizing the future is actually, I think, much more fraught for us than it seems. And so, I mean, I don't have a big presentation here, and I don't have really some sort of simple solution. But I do see the problem that's embedded, and I would say this in some senses structurally. So this is very, very difficult to overcome in the institutions that are around us, whether it's schools or governments, that they are all rooted, structured by this desire to know whether they're going to do better or worse, and whether they're going to be able to preserve themselves, and whether they're going to be able to inscribe themselves in some sort of immortality. And for me, that, in some senses, fundamentally estranges us from the universe we live in. that in and of itself is a cognitive dissonance. It's a pain. It's actually, it creates, it means that our identity as humans is not at peace, in harmony with the world in which we live. And that in order for us to get to the social responsibility and the morality, we need to really fundamentally break from that system, which is more than, it's a system and processes, and it's so much of what we do, it's even our psychology. I think it would, for instance, with tools, it would embed tools in a much more symbiotic relationship to us. And we would know that tools can be used to construct and to kill, or whatever, but that we experiment, and then we could be in an experimentalist posture, and some of the experiments would go awry, and some of us would die. But we prefer to live in a world where experimentation and our relationship to not knowing is sufficiently accepted that we understand that's the price you pay for being existentially alive. And for me, that would be the social responsibility. Fundamentally social, fundamentally friend-based, community, network, because all of that depends on us being able to share with each other. But it would be radically, I think, different from what we've seen up until now. And I'll end with this. It's a little quest that I've been on for a very long time, and maybe some others as well, which is I've always tried to understand what Lao Tzu meant by doing and not doing. And how that could be a meaningful term, other than just saying, oh, you don't act, which is obviously not what it means. And so I think that we have some very long-standing philosophical, may I even say spiritual issues that are certainly deeply emotive, that are hard for us to address. And for me, that would be one of the paths in any case to dealing with this question of how can anticipatory power be used to make social responsibility and morality more, how can I put it? I'm not even going to say good or bad or moral 10 commandments or not, but more harmonious. If I could just say harmony.
Thank you, Ru, for that. So, many of you know, Ru is head of foresight at UNESCO, very concerned for social justice and on a global scale, doing wonderful things in terms of developing futures literacy and futures capability all over the world. And just to bring this short set of presentations to open up the debate to a close, Roberto, is responsible anticipation possible?
No idea, but we have to start from the difference between forecast and foresight, because responsibility makes different, has a different meaning in the two different cases. And to begin understanding the underlying issue, let me present the difference between forecast and foresight on steroids, so to say. And I will use the difference between megatrends and visioning. Megatrends are typically those transformations that have been running for decades and promise to continue running for other decades. Think about world population. We presently are about 7.5 billion people. The UN forecast tell us that for the end of the century there will be more than 11 billion people on Earth. There is almost nothing we can do with that. Even a world war won't change this transformation. 10 billion deaths means nothing with respect to the magnitude of the transformation. In that situation, the only thing we can do is be ready, trying to understand what's happening and being ready for the consequences that may arise from such a transformation. And there are quite a number of major megatrends of this kind around us. Cities are growing exponentially. Again, UN forecasts 2 years ago there was about 1 million kilometers square covered by cities. For 2050, the idea is there will be 2.5 million square kilometers covered by cities. It's a major transformation on energy. We are consuming more and more and more and more energy since decades. And I think, unfortunately, there is no hope to reverse this trend in the forthcoming decades. We are going to consume more energy, whatever it means, and whichever consequences there will be on other aspects. So megatrends are such that the likelihood to change them is exceedingly thin, to put it positively. And so, what we can do is to understand the transformation and being ready for the consequences. Apart from megatrends, there are situations that are really open. Situations in which the outcome is not already visible or traced. And for instance, I take the future of jobs as one of the authentically open trend. And which means that most of what we read about the future of work, and we take it with extreme care, because they are usually very simplified, oversimplified projections over an extremely complex situation. But put it away. The fact that there are trends and transformations that are authentically open means that there are various possibilities, that there may be different outcomes. And here is where we bear responsibility, because what we do may change the final outcome. And in that sense, the decisions we take, the strategies we develop, may have different consequences. And from that point of view, and there is no escape from that, take responsibility for that. While in the first case, responsibility is on a thin basis, so to say, the only responsibility we can have is in being ready for the transformation, so that we can eventually lower the sufferings or exploit the possibilities that may arise. In the second case, we have a wider, our responsibility is on a wider basis, because what we do may change the final outcome. And so there is no escape for assuming this latter responsibility.
So my name is Rebecca Raw. I'm a professor of modern languages and creative futures at Lancaster University, where I'm also co-director of the Institute for Social Futures. And the panel that we've put together today, is very much an ISF, Institute for Social Futures, very much an ISF kind of piece. It's a little bit like coming and spending a Tuesday morning with us. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the ISF is, just so you can understand what we're trying to do in this panel. The ISF was founded in 2015 with all sorts of aims in mind, but particularly with a core mission of bringing together people from across lots of different disciplines and academe and beyond academe. So really a space to create a new way of thinking and talking about the future. Although we're the Institute of Social Futures, One of our core beliefs at ISF is that we need to find new ways of thinking about what we're doing right now. If we're going to avoid the danger of falling into a sort of a fatalistic acceptance of the future. Just let people do what you're doing right now to avoid fatalism. Please do come to this. So it's quite easy to get caught up thinking about the future when you're thinking about the future from your own disciplinary perspective. It's quite easy to get taken up with a particular trend that everybody's talking about in your field, a particular way of thinking about things, or a certain technological development that might seem like it's really going to have some kind of apparently self-evident transformative effect on the bit of the world that's your research expertise. And we think that in the Institute for Social Futures it's really important to manage to stand back from that and get into dialogue with people who bring other perspectives, whether it's from another academic discipline or whether it's that bringing together practical experience with sort of a more theoretical approach to things. So you really need to step outside of your comfort zone and present your ideas to others working in different areas, and that's something that we try to do in all sorts of different ways at the ISF. We're the Institute for Social Futures because the future is inherently relational. It's being made right now by lots of different people doing things, relating to each other, whether planned or not. And it's really actually very difficult. There are very few spaces that one can create where people come together and actually think their things together. How do those combined interactions really affect the different ways that we think about the future, and therefore how should we perhaps be a little more aware of what's going on in all sorts of different walks of life? So the Institute for Social Futures is really emphasising how do we grasp that relationality. In order to grasp how things cohere, you need the input from social sciences and humanities. So we're particularly set up to make sure that we have impetus coming from across the university, that when we're doing futures research, it's not just being led by technology and scientific developments, and although those are of course also core to what we do, but that we're finding a way of bringing that into dialogue with social sciences and humanities. So we're trying to find a way of fleshing out today's visions of the future, fleshing them out with real people and their needs as they're likely to exist tomorrow. And in order to do this, obviously we need to be talking, sharing ideas, and seeing that in the round. Seeing that in the round with quite a lot of people in front of you. So we're also very sociable, we like to have lots of people. Please do find a place to sit so you can actually see the speakers. So my opening message to you is that the time of social futures is right now in this panel, where there are lots of people who are going to be talking to each other from lots of different disciplinary perspectives, and bringing and pairing the sort of the academic research in future studies with hands-on practical experience drawn from a wealth of different fields. We've brought together 4 pairs of researchers and practitioners from diverse fields who are each going to develop in conversation a couple of key points that they find especially pertinent to the way they're acting in the present in response to different visions of the future. About 15 minutes for each conversation, just so you have a little sense of the format. So we have 4 pairs giving their sense from the fields that they represent, and I'll go on to tell you what the fields are in a minute, about how they're engaging with the challenge of the future in what they do right now, also always informed by the past, and that's something that will come out, I think, in the conversation. So there are obviously points to be made here about when and where social futures start and end, as well as how we talk about them in theory and make them in practice. And it's going to be my job to try and pull out those ideas as the conversations unfold. But it's your job as the audience to help me, because it's quite a broad range that we've got here. So the format of what we're doing is also very timely, in as much as I am going to keep everybody to time. So 15 minutes, and after that I say no more, be quiet, you've had your chance. The idea being that we'd like to leave some time at the end, a good 20 minutes or so, to have some exchange across the conversations. At that point, it's quite a cosy setup in here. If people want to include their thoughts, questions, observations from the audience, you're very welcome to. But what I'm not going to do is that awkward kind of, thank you very much for your talks now, I'm sure there are lots of questions. We're just going to let it evolve a little bit more naturally. So if you have something burning that you want to share with us, please do. Okay, on to the speakers. Peter Kalu, who is going to join us in style in a moment, is a poet, storyteller, fiction writer and playwright. He started writing as a member of Manchester, UK's Moss Side Write Black Writers' Workshop and has had 8 novels, 2 film scripts and 3 theatre plays produced to date. He's artistic director of Manchester-based writer development organisation Common Word and fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. You're going to hear him in conversation with Emily Spires, who is sitting on the end here. Emily is a lecturer in creative futures at the ISF. Her work focuses on future-oriented, innovative trends in communicative and literary practices, and explores how preferable futures are being envisaged, anticipated, and made through art and literature. So the thing to remember is we've got an arty conversation to start with Emily and Pete. Stephen Hill, here, is Chartered Planning and Development Surveyor with extensive public and private sector experience in both housing and planning. He is Director of C20 Future Planners, Land Economists and Spatial Planners, as well as a board member of the National Community Land Trust and the UK Co-Housing Networks. He speaks and writes on professional ethics, citizen-inspired housing and land and housing markets. He will be in conversation with Melissa Fernandez-Aragocia, who is a lecturer in urban futures at the ISF. Her work focuses on the realm of the home as a critical space, where historical desires, everyday life, and future aspirations intersect. She is particularly interested in the discourses, practices, and materialities that make and unmake housing during times of crisis and austerity in the name of imagined futures. So our second conversation is one very much about the idea of co-housing, how you plan for it, what kind of issues it raises from a practical and from a theoretical perspective. Moving on, we have Greg Davis to my right. Greg built and led for a decade the banking world's first behavioural finance team as head of behavioural quantitative finance at Barclays. In 2016, Greg founded Centaps, a firm dedicated to helping people and organisations make better decisions using insights from behavioural science. He's an associate fellow at Oxford Saïd Business School, a lecturer at Imperial College London, and, most excitingly, the creator of Open Outcry, a reality opera that premiered in London in 2012 and created a live performance from a trading floor. So if things go a little off-rail, you're going to conduct us out of the problem. He's going to be in conversation with Emre Tarim, who is a lecturer in behavioural sciences at Lancaster University Management School. Emre has published on sociological and behavioural dynamics of financial decision-making among professional and retail investors. He is currently researching how immigrants save and invest in host and home countries and what this implies for our understanding of immigration and integration. So a very interesting finance-based discussion thinking about the different time scales when it comes to economics and behavioural patterns. Our last conversation is between Michael Hebert and Carlos Lopez Galvez. Michael, right at the end of our line, has had a distinguished career that's taken him across disciplines including history, geography and planning. Since 2012, he's Emeritus Professor of Town Planning at the Bartlett School at University College London. Michael is the editor of Planning Perspectives, the leading international journal in planning history. And he was chairman of London Crossrail Design Review Panel, which must have involved quite a few interesting conversations, I should have thought, Michael. He will be speaking with Carlos Lopez Galvez, is lecturer in the theories and methods of social futures at the ISF. He has published widely on 19th century London and Paris, including Global Undergrounds, which came out in 2016. His work interrogates the relationship between history and the future, with a focus on cities, infrastructure, and cultural heritage. So our final conversation is very much bringing history, geography, the humanities back into that sense of how do we plan for the future in an urban context. Okay, that's enough talk from me. I'm going to pass you over to Emily, and then I'm going to just be the vicious person who intervenes every 15 minutes.
Right, so what Rebecca meant by Pete arriving in style is that he's going to miraculously appear on the screen in front of us. He's obviously a very well-respected author. At the moment, he's in Spain receiving a prize, so he can't be here in person. So we held our interview back in September, our conversation, and videoed it. And because I had the power of the editing suite, I was able to reduce myself to subtitles on the screen and really give Pete the whole stage to answer my questions and think through the concepts and ideas that I wanted to engage in with him. So here it is, and I'll pass you over to...
But before you do, I forgot to say, because you talked about editing suite, it reminded me that we're being videoed. So just to say that the recording is coming, it'll just get the back of your heads, but if anybody's uncomfortable about that, I'd like you to know that it's happening right now. Okay.
I'll hand you over now to Pete.
When I write, I don't think in those terms particularly. I've got other concerns, probably more close concerns than such general concepts as the aesthetic excellence. And in my mind, thinking about it, I kind of flipped it on its head, and I thought, well, what would anesthetic excellence mean? And I'd be like, I'm going in for an operation. I want the anaesthetic to work really, really well, so I feel nothing. And so aesthetic excellence will be the reverse of that, where I have total feeling for the characters and for the problem, the situation they're in. I'm at one, I'm rooting for them in some way. That's in terms of the people, the characters. Then, for me, generally, I think art, I hate these generalizations, I just write them, but when you reflect on it, art tends to, or at least narrative tends to impose pattern. And some of the aesthetics are about that sense of harmony that comes from the imposition by the author of a pattern on chaos. Plausibility. I think, I guess it's just speculation for me, but readers will forgive a lot because, that suspension of disbelief, they know it's a story, they know that it's not true. If you can get the characters such that they in some way shine, they run in such a way that people feel, the readers feel, I get this person. I'm not that person necessarily, but I get this person. I can feel what they feel, and I know why they're feeling that way. Even if those feelings are very extreme, or based on unusual circumstances, that sympathy or empathy, whichever way it is, that the reader gets, I think that's the bedrock of plausibility. And so a lot of the arguments around early science fiction were that while the worlds created were magnificent, the characters were flat, the characters were so stereotypical or shallow that most people just didn't want to read it. And that affected not necessarily the plausibility of the world created, but the idea that human beings would be working within that world. So there was a tension, there is a tension between those two things, between the world building and people building. It's that calibration. Of course, the text will build both really, really well. I'm not sure that when I wrote that novel, Black Star Rising, that I was thinking at all about plausibility. I can give you a backstory on it. which is are interesting. I wrote the two before Black Star Rising, Big Shot and Professor X. I wrote them set in the now, as in set in the contemporary time, which was, let's not ask when it was, but it's a couple of decades ago. And I sent them off to the publisher, and they said, yeah, we'll publish them, but to use your language, they're not plausible. This wouldn't happen now. Mainly, it's because I created this high-ranking black hole. There wouldn't be one. It's impossible. The readers will just throw it away and say, no, honestly. So what we're supposed to do is set in the future. And that's how I came to write the first two, set in the future, because the idea that there'd be a highly ranking black hole in the UK at that time was not believable, they said. So after I'd done those first two, I thought, well, if we're going to set something in the future, let's set it properly in the future. And that's how I came to write Black Star Rising. That was 1,000 years from now. But my concern really there was, well, first of all, in terms of audience, and the plausibility for which audience, that I wasn't really writing for any readership other than the UK black readership, maybe American black readership. That was what I was focused on. I wasn't really considering anyone else. And within that, I knew that science fiction had very few black people existing within certainly UK science fiction. And so there was this sort of, we've been written of the future, we've disappeared, So the act of writing Black Star Rising was to establish in one, we will be in the future, and that was the first thing. Two, that counter to the stereotypes that sometimes problem, we can be rock scientists, rocket scientists, as well as rock scientists, could be geologists, and linguists, all the other types of expertise, the scientific expertise, also from humanities. There is no bound on what we can achieve in terms of thinking. That back then may have been somewhat controversial, or at least contrary to the stereotype. And then the third thing was that it's about who are we? Are we always going to be defined by white supremacy, as this phrase is? And what I was trying to do was say, okay, if we bring all these black people together in one place, then we can demonstrate or show characters who live much more full lives that of greater individuation, of greater specificness, that can emerge more fully human than when they're being hampered by the pressures of a racialized society. So that was the third project, or aim within the novel. And so, in terms of plausibility, the idea is, okay, here's a novel to the readers, can you see this? Can you share this future? Can you dream? I like the idea of anticipation having a positive and a negative, and you've got the anticipation positively. I think I always think about it in terms of when we're very young, 4, 5, 6, our birthdays come up, and there's no more intense positive anticipation than, it's our birthday coming up, and a negative anticipation, which is the foreboding, the dread, which is gothic or horror. So with the thrillers, if you like, the crime fiction thrillers that I've written, it struck me that thrillers are quite naive in some respects, because you've got this idea that better world that can be achieved, a world that is the present of the story. And generally all the hustle and bustle of the drama, of the action of the is trying to get to that better world. Something happens, something's going to go wrong, but less and less and less and less. But it's predicated on the idea that the world can be bigger. The individual is able to achieve change, is able to affect the course of events, and in that way, the individual is empowered, and the main character is kind of a bit of a hero to be able to change that world. That's not through this, I think, work. And then the reader, spinning the cameras around, the reader is in the shoes, riding with the main character as she goes about trying to transform that world. And by riding with them, they have this sense that maybe we have to can change the world in some way. It's a good question, and I don't think I have a standard formula. For myself, I've been more and more interested in the idea that the novel is the examination of consciousness of what it's like for us as humans, what we carry in our mind, what we're thinking at any one time, what we're feeling at any one time. In that sense, at any one moment, I sometimes feel we're here now, we listen to you right now. I'm also remembering the chicken I ate 2 hours ago, and from that, my mind's often operating, maybe all my mind's operating in many places along that timeline at once, and the exploration of that is something that is intriguing and healthy. It's important, something that writers can do with that examination of consciousness, of what's going through our minds. So, in terms of the question becomes, to some extent, to what extent are we living in the future, to what extent are we living in the past, and how much of the now are we carrying? Things that I've been meditating around, I've been looking at that equation, at those simultaneous existences we have, both in the past, future, present. And from that you start to theorize about the nature of time. That big idea of time is actually bound up and wrapped up in ontology, the nature of being, and the existential questions about why we are here, if there is any meaning to life. And so, at the moment, what I've been working on writing about is artificial intelligence and how that leap to sentience occurs. So then you think, okay, well, what is it about human beings that will keep the AI autonomous being at bay? Well, we've got a handle on time that's better than theirs at the moment. We can sift around through it. We have that ability to speculate on the future. And we can come at things in vastly different ways. Maybe one thing that writing can do, if it does it, if it's so minded, is it can destabilize our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of the world of now. A lot of the dialogue or the work that is done by writers is reconstructions of the past, demolitions of the past, in order that the present is understood in a different way, and so that we may envisage a future that is different from the one that seems to be coming upon us with some degree of inevitability. Writers tend to bring to the party voices that connections that may not be being made by planners or those who speculate more technically about the future. And for that reason, we are very good stress testers of visions. We bring a different way of thinking about the future, a more human-centered thinking about the future, to pertain to discussions of speculations on the future. And we're so, as a body of people, with such biscuits between us, we should catch a lot of things that was like this.
Emily, you've got 3 seconds left. Would you like to just sum up what's come from
Assalamu
that?
alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The Quran.
It was just saying hi.
Well, I think what Pete's thinking there really brought beautifully to the fore is precisely the ways in which the work he does is a kind of way of stress testing vision of the future. I think that phrase puts it quite beautifully. And the ways in which the work he does really brings the human more sharply into focus in the process of building worlds. And I suppose there are lots of different fields where worlds get built. But I think what Pete showed so beautifully in his argument was that you can be proficient in creating and developing plausible worlds, that you can build worlds that are flawless in lots of different kinds of ways, but unless you also equally sort of build and take care about the ways in which you build the human beings who are going to be walking in that world, the world in itself in the future won't actually be a complete vision of the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That moves us nicely on to our first planning discussions.
Yeah. So quite a jump here. Thank you, Stephen, first of all, for coming here. Stephen was actually, as a practitioner, with a co-housing group immediately before this conversation, so it's very, very timely. I kind of wanted to start with a few comments for those of you that don't know or haven't heard about co-housing. I kind of wanted to get that out of the way and just say what the definition is, the very, very basic definition. Co-housing communities are intentional communities that are created, developed, and run by their residents. Each household has a self-contained private home that can be rented or owned, as well as a shared community space, and that shared community space is key to the definition of co-housing. Often these residential spaces are co-designed by the residents and architects, so there's a whole process there of co-design that's also core. The movement has a very long history. It's quite popular in certain European countries like Germany, the Netherlands, increasingly France, Spain, the US, Australia. It's becoming more and more popular in the UK. Stephen is a member of the UK Co-Housing Network that represents members of that movement. Here, senior co-housing is specifically kind of designed co-housing for the over 50s. So I'll bring in that question of age and time into co-housing as well. For me, the key kind of reason why I brought co-housing to this space is because I think co-housing brings in the realm of the future in a number of ways, and in a huge amount of ways actually. So in terms of planning, future home life is being planned for both at the individual and the collective level in these endeavors. The form, the meaning, and the practices of mainstream housing, so the housing we all kind of are more associated to, are being deeply unsettled and disrupted by these kind of citizen-led practices. So there's something about enacting an alternative future, but also disrupting senses of age. So particularly in senior co-housing, the way we think about age and our own futures, family futures, etc., tradition, that's being explored in very different ways. And finally, as housing and social and a political movement, because it involves all of this actually, it involves very different scales of anticipation. So you have the personal scale, as I mentioned before, so personal stories of family, aging, etc. You have the collective scale of anticipating those futures, again, about thinking about family and age. You have the design and material scale, right? That's anticipating and prefiguring how people live together and kind of molding that in a built environment form. And then you have the political or policy scale, where you have multiple actors, public, private, and associate and alliances that are operating with very distinct temporalities or very different notions of the times that go into building these very different kind of anticipated futures, depending on priorities and interests. So, Stephen, I kind of see your role, in a sense, as a way to manage these very different scales. In a sense, you're speaking to many of these different actors that are involved in the co-housing world. In a sense, just to kind of segue that with Emily's conversation before, I think you're creating a story about co-housing. There's something there that you're doing about creating a narrative for these different people that want to build co-housing or want to promote something. So I guess my first question is back to this issue of narrative and storytelling, and whether you would describe your role as a storyteller of an alternative future, and also key there how history plays a role in that storytelling that you do, if that is the way that you conceptualize that.
Yeah, I think storytelling is a good way of thinking about it, because at the moment our relationship with our housing, we're very passive consumers. We're very passive consumers of policy. Governments make housing policy entirely with the supply side. They never talk to the demand side. So our role as citizens, consumers, never gets factored into the way new housing policy emerges. Likewise, house builders don't really engage with their consumers. They take a very limited view of how they're meeting demand. It's an industry that's notoriously unresponsive to demand. So I think we're not really accustomed to the idea that we can, as citizens, we can really shape what our housing looks like. I'm talking specifically about new building. We clearly have a lot more choice in relation to existing buildings, and papers are full of what we get up to do in reshaping our existing environment. But when you look at what's being produced by the market, there's a kind of incentive where you have to, you're not going to buy it and then start mucking around with it. You kind of reshape it, you take what it is. So we're not very good at imagining that we could do more than we currently do. So the role of somebody like me is to simply unlock the possibility that other things are possible. And actually that doesn't really take much doing in many cases. Because if you ask people would they like to build their own home, there aren't many people who say no. Because everybody in their mind has some kind of idea of an ideal fantasy, however fantastic. So I think it's the unlocking of that, or just creating the space in which people can think about things differently. Co-housing is specifically about the kind of social organisation, and get a few people in the room, and it really doesn't take very long before people start having ideas and it becomes a very naturally creative environment. The job then is to help them reconcile whatever ambitions and creative ideas come out of that with the practical realities of getting the scheme built. But interestingly, more and more people are also thinking about reimagining where they live at the moment. So could they get some of the benefits of co-housing, some kind of social organisation in a neighbourhood, virtual networks, rather than going through the complete pain and agony of building a new development. It's about the most difficult thing you can imagine doing. And where I've been this morning was the older women's co-housing group that some of you may have heard about. It's just finished at Christmas, and it's up in New Barnet. It took them 18 years from that kind of first glimmer of the idea to moving in. The actual practical bit of when they started, they were complete pioneers. Nobody knew about co-housing, so they were trying to be champions of a new idea in an environment that was very non-receptive to new ideas. And and then go about the practical business of being a developer with no capital, which is where in fact, most citizens are, because we don't have our own capital that we know how to do things. We're like small house builders, really. They're in a very similar position. But I think what they've managed to do, and I actually took a mainstream developer to see them this morning, and they were completely bowled over by the experience. I think partly by the scheme, which is lovely, but I think more particularly about the people who inhabit it. I think it was a real eye-opener to see how extraordinary, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And it just needed somebody, in that case, Maria Brenton, to be that kind of facilitator that just started off the process of helping them imagine a different future.
Just to kind of draw on that a little bit more in terms of the contrast between co-housing as something that's alternative or a vision of an alternative future versus what we do get, which is mainstream housing. And you just mentioned a key example of the kinds of different actors that operate on very different temporalities and very different notions, for instance, of the value of housing or future housing. So a mainstream housing developer, would be thinking about value as economic value, and they have these very complicated valuation processes, etc. Whereas a co-housing group has a kind of social value that is being created as they act, and they are collectively thinking about what it is that they want to do, how it is that they want to live in the future. So in terms of your role, and you mentioned before, kind of unlocking that possibility, unlocking that creative potential of thinking about the future, how do you reconcile that mainstream kind of temporality of housing development with an alternative temporality?
But you have to do two things simultaneously. One is you have to give the group they have to be very clear that they are embarking on a very capital-intensive, risky project. So there has to be a lot of discipline to that. But within that, you can also be very creative in imagining the ways of doing things, and things that don't cost a lot of money. Because most of what co-housing brings is their own kind of social organisation, that kind of creativity amongst people. And looking at the older women's co-housing scheme today with the developer, they're saying, well, basically they're doing some very simple things well. Good orientation, lots of light, lively circulation spaces that can be animated. Those are things that don't cost extra money. They just need to be thought about and designed well. And all the things that make it a special place with the potential for people to live more interesting lives as they get older are the things that the building facilitates that in terms of environment, space, opportunities for social interaction. But it is the activities that the people themselves start to animate the building. And I would say that when not just about co-housing groups, I'd say this is about all community housing groups, is that once they get going, all sorts of things start happening, which were never planned, which is, in my opinion, is a really good thing. Because it's very important that people like me don't bring an overarching kind of financial discipline to it. That has to be the bedrock on which they're working, and they have to be realistic about where they're going to get the money. But then it's up to them to be thinking about the way they want to live. I think what we find with most people is that they wouldn't necessarily call themselves as being very political. They're not seeing this as a political act, but actually it is highly political. They're articulating the way in which they want to live, which in many cases is simply not on offer. So if you're working with community land trusts, it's about effectively decapitalising your most valuable asset. This is a place to live, it's not an investment. And it's an investment that it's an asset that has to be passed on to the next occupier and the next, so that they can benefit from it in the same way. Co-housing, I think, our experience in the UK is mixed. So we've got they're mostly intergenerational, but they tend to be intergenerational at the top end of the age range, because these are people with existing housing equity. and that's a function of how difficult it is to raise money for this. So if there were other ways of raising money, it would be open to many more people. You get a much wider age range, ethnicity range, and income range.
It wasn't actually.
It's not as fun. Okay. Also ended like that.
We are
Close
pretty
to
much at time, so maybe just
a few minutes. Yeah.
just one last thought.
Okay, well, I have many other thoughts, but we had a conversation before, and I thought you used a really kind of powerful phrase when you were describing your role as a professional advisor of sorts. And you said, yes, it's all good to, to anticipate the future, and that's what you're doing, and others are doing, so sense. But that, there is such a thing as too much anticipating.
Yeah.
And I wondered if I could just pick your brain a little bit about, what is the threshold of anticipation? Is there such a thing as a threshold of anticipation? And why do you see it as too much? What's so risky about anticipating too much?
Yeah, it's, I can't remember what my answer was. I think, in a sense, because you're talking about the way in which people's lives will pan out, you shouldn't be trying to plan that too much. I mean, whose business is it to do that? I think it's much more important that you have some kind of basic platform from which lots of things can happen. The co-housing group is a self-regulating entity. It has to take responsibility for how it makes that building function, how they live their lives within it, and in the community around it. And I think it's more important that they've got that capacity to be adaptive and resilient over time, rather than imagining too many things too far in the future. And I think there's a real danger of continuing is that in the end, ideas about clever technology take over, and you begin to forget about social organisation. And in the end, it's the strength of the social organisation that will sustain that in the future.
That's a great place to move on. And whose business is it to plan out what's going to happen? Well, like, I'm supposed to be. Whoa, hello. Yeah.
Yes, that's
We'll ask you that question, Rick.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think finance is an area where anticipation allows you to make money, or maybe forces you to lose money. So I think the reason why I wanted to talk about finance today is, maybe us as people, ordinary people, we don't think about finance too much because we kind of black box it. We kind of think that there's a certain technology to finance, it works in a certain way, it's efficient. Well, maybe it's not efficient, so you have a crisis. So we kind of black box financing and people involved in financial markets. When you look at the way financial markets are studied, you can actually win a Nobel Prize in economics in the way you theorize about markets, and you can call them efficient, you can call everyone rational. But when you look at the real financial markets, Greg can allude to that. There's so much price volatility and so much trading activity that is not anticipated by Nobel Prize winning in theory. So. And I think my motivation comes from the fact that actually this is to do with different ways of anticipating, as Steve and Melissa actually talked about in the housing market. So there's not a huge difference between the housing market, the housing providers, and financial markets. Actually, finance professionals and retail investors which generate that kind of uncertainty by anticipating the future in different ways. And in doing so, because they share the same marketplace, they actually have to cope with it. So it's a very social, very relational thing, the way financial markets work. So that's why I'm here to ask Greg about his experiences as a behavioral economist and as a finance professional. How can we describe all these different ways of anticipating in financial markets along the lines of professional investors, which we are actually very dependent on as pension fund holders, and also as retail investors. Maybe some of us in this room, we are actually trading in the financial markets if we are insane enough. When I look at what Melissa and Steve said, they mentioned storytelling. It's a way of anticipating the future. Actually, finance professionals, in my view, they are doing the same thing, but they are actually also using mathematical models or calculative devices, but they combine them with different ways of telling stories about the future. So they frame the future, they actually perform the future as well. But we don't have one present and one future in the market. We actually have presents and futures in the market. So there's a plurality, and I think that plurality underpins the volatility and uncertainty in markets. What I'm going to ask Greg to begin with is, how many different ways of anticipating have you experienced and seen in financial markets, Greg? Let's start with the professional investors.
Well, okay. So I'm sort of struck, you're focusing on investors here, and I think it's probably worth saying in advance that in addition to investing in financial decision making, there are all sorts of other decisions that we make as well. So we could think not just about investing, but also about savings decisions or about insurance decisions. And these are all things that effectively ask people to both rationally and emotionally trade off in their decision making how they feel in the present with certain aspects of the future and what they want to achieve or not achieve in the future. If I could slightly sidestep the focus on professionals, because I think there are some threads here that run through all financial decision making, regardless of whether you're a retail investor or a saver or a professional. And this is of course very topical at the moment. You mentioned Nobel Prize winners for their work on markets and market structure, but the most recent economics Nobel Prize winner 2 weeks ago was Dick Thaler for his work on behavioral economics and behavioral finance, and indeed these issues of how regular people make decisions. But going back a little bit further before Dick Thaler, in 2002 the Nobel Prize for Economics was won by Daniel Kahneman, father of behavioral economics. And in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, he draws this distinction, which wasn't, by the way, originally his, although it's often attributed to him now, of this notion of system 1 and system 2 thinking. When we as humans make decisions, we make decisions not as though we have a single brain that is poured at that decision and comes up with a single answer. We seem to make decisions much in the way as though there are two separate systems of reasoning brought to bear on any decision we make. And one of those systems of reasoning is the one that we could call the deliberative brain. It allows me to walk sequentially and logically through a problem and figure out what the quote-unquote right answer is, what the answer that most maximizes my objectives. The other system is my emotional brain. It's the one that responds to narrative, the one that responds to stories, the one that has gut feel intuitions in it. And there's a huge, for many problems that we face in life, it doesn't matter that these two systems come to different answers. In fact, there's many situations where they come to the same answer. And then there's a bunch of things where it doesn't matter if they come to different answers. If you want to go to a coffee shop in the morning and you're trying to decide between the 59 different types of coffee on offer at Starbucks or whatever, it really doesn't matter that you haven't come to the optimal decision because the consequences are low. But for decisions like savings behavior, like investing, like insurance behavior, if your emotional brain comes to a different decision than your logical and deliberative brain would be, you've got an issue. Firstly, how do you square that circle? Which one do you follow? And the answer for most people is that we follow the emotional brain. We use heuristics, we have biases. We are, as humans, massively inclined to do what feels comfortable rather than what is the logically right decision. And that comes from a number of places. One is simply that to turn on our deliberative logical brain is taxing. It takes energy. And if you doubt this, I challenge you, try walking down the road with someone and at some point just spit out at them a quick problem of mental arithmetic. And what's 213 plus 572? I have no idea what the answer is, but I guarantee you they will stop walking in order to give you the answer to that problem. Because it's hard work for us to think logically and sequentially through problems. And in financial decisions, we have this disconnect where you're asking people to solve problems that very often we don't face many times in our life. So we cannot learn from experience, because you only buy a house once every 10, 15 years or whatever. You only invest for retirement, or you don't do these things often. So you can't learn from experience. The other thing is, once you do make a decision, you often don't find out whether it was right or wrong until several months or several years into the future. So the feedback loop is incredibly slow. And the third reason is the rules are always changing. So unlike playing chess, where I can play the same game again and again and again with the same rules and I get quick feedback, that's where we can train our intuitive brain. We all know these stories of chess grandmasters who can glance at a chessboard and instantly see the next best move. They aren't thinking logically through that sequentially, they just have trained their intuition. Financial decisions have none of those features. So we are in a world where it is very likely that the right answer is very different from a comfortable answer. And that's the constant tension that we have. So even professional investors, although they've got all these tools, you know, the deliberative brain, I build an Excel spreadsheet, I plug into Bloomberg, I've got all the data, etc. It will set out this right answer. I've done all my research, and yet there's still a corner of my brain going, yeah, but I'm just not comfortable enough with that. So you'll find that people, often in small ways, just deviate from what the logical thing is to do in order to satisfy their need and the craving for immediate emotional comfort. And that's one of the things that I think causes this excess volatility that you measure. Because genuinely, the right answer for investing, if you're investing for something 10 years out, what you should do now doesn't change very much day to day. And yet we can observe that the markets change phenomenally day to day. And there is no rational basis why the markets should be as volatile as they are. And so the basis must be something else. And I think the basis is effectively on humans' emotional response to stories, and to context, and to what we feel, and what we read about in the newspaper every morning.
Okay, great. That's a fascinating journey into our brains. But I want you to be honest here. Who do you blame for most of the volatility stemming from the city? You don't have to name names, but is it the pension funds? The people that we trust our money. Is it the hedge funds? From an organizational, cultural perspective, how do you see the greater picture, Greg, in terms of the sources of volatility? I understand we're all human beings.
Yeah. So there has always been volatility, and there's always been excess volatility. Our opinions of the world change faster than the world changes, frankly. We have to start classing investors into categories depending on their time horizons. So pension funds, for example, are probably not to blame for a lot of the volatility because they make decisions relatively infrequently and relatively slowly. Probably still too much. You can talk to a whole lot of people and ask a simple question. How often do you think you should buy and sell in order to do well in the markets? And it doesn't matter what people tell you the answer to that is, the right answer is less than you think you should. And so even for pension funds with really long time horizons, they're probably doing too much. Individual investors, or what are sometimes called noise traders, those of us who are just buying and selling on a whim, they are perhaps more responsible. A lot of professional investors who are buying and selling on faster things are even more responsible because they're buying large blocks of shares on a daily basis. But these days you have something that exacerbates that even more, which are the ultra short-term algorithmic traders. So effectively the machines doing this for you. And they inject extra volatility for two reasons. One is because they're responding on much shorter time frames, and they're responding, lightning fast. I mean, it's incredible. There are blocks of buildings in New York that are just filled with computers, and they are there because they want to be as close as possible to the stock exchange to minimize the length of fiber optic cable between when they receive a signal or not.
So they're going for the shorter distance. It's a kissing contest in a different way.
Microseconds. And so one is they're doing much more, but the second problem with the algorithmic stuff is they respond to what they see other people doing, and then they exacerbate it. So you effectively see an amplification of signal. So it's not true that everyone is equally responsible for that volatility. And one thing that might be worth saying is actually, really, volatility doesn't matter. It shouldn't matter. As an individual, if you're invested for a 5 or 10 year horizon, where the markets are going up and down today, is absolutely irrelevant. The trouble is, it's only irrelevant in a logical sense. It's not irrelevant in an emotional sense, because we see it going up and down and it worries us.
We have to make sense of it.
We have to make sense of it. So think about this, if you are a homeowner, and the value of your house drops by 10% in the next 6 months, how would you even know? You would have no idea, so you wouldn't get stressed about that. That's one of the reasons why stock markets are so interesting, is precisely their liquidity and their transparency induces an emotional response in society that itself has a feedback loop to it that can be quite dangerous.
Yeah. From what you have told me, emotions seem to be playing a great role here, despite the fact that we have made so many advances, scientific advances, and technological advances. But at the end of the day, we are human beings. I mean, is there a normative side to how we understand the markets? Should markets be in a certain way, like the housing markets or the stock markets, or have we actually reached a certain level of development where we don't have to actually innovate or anticipate a different future? Are they functioning properly, or do you anticipate a different, more positive future as a practitioner and as a
So
scholar?
I think that's very difficult to answer without bringing the political and moral domain into this, because markets don't have a goal. Markets are simply a collection of transactions, and as such they are amoral. I mean, some people would say they are immoral in some way, but that is putting a political slant on it. So a market is a way of allowing people to do on a small scale what they want to do, and that aggregates up into meaningful activities. So this was, I mean, you mentioned the open outcry opera thing we did. It was to try and portray the beauty of the market, because in many ways a market is a bit like, you see those if anyone's been watching the Blue Planet 2, right? These shoals of fish moving around, or flocks of birds in murmuration. It's quite beautiful. But what you have is emergent properties of a whole group of individuals creating something that at the high level looks quite beautiful, but is constructed of individuals basically doing a much smaller thing. And that's what a market is. I mean, lots of little people doing little things, which creates big political and sociological consequences. So if the purpose of a market is to allocate capital or to spread risk around, then you kind of want them to be as efficient and unfettered as possible. If you want a market to lead to specific social distributive effects or justice effects, then you might want to sacrifice efficiency in order to achieve those goals.
And that's doable.
It's doable. It's a question. The question is who chooses what to do, and then it becomes a political question, not an emotional question, and well, probably an emotional question, but it's not a question for market efficiency. It's a question for what we wish markets to be.
Yes.
What to do, what to achieve.
Yes.
So
And that's a great note to end, I think.
that's a great place to end. And again, I think just carrying a question forward, the question of who chooses what to do, how are our choices informed by the past. We're going to get through to the humanities end of our conversation with Michael and Carlos.
I think one way of connecting to the three conversations that we've had so far is by thinking about the relationship between locking and unlocking. And I like the idea of unlocking that actually takes about 18 years. And an interest that Michael and I share is to do with a city like London, but also the role that thinking about infrastructure in a city plays historically when thinking about the future of that city. So one of the to me very important questions that history raises is twofold. One is that largely there's nothing natural nor inevitable about things, the situations where we find ourselves. But also when you actually discover that next to, say, the envisioning of the London Underground in the 1830s or 1840s, or any of the cities where you live and the transport infrastructure that goes with it, that was just one of the visions. There were plenty of competing visions around the same time. So an important question that history raises is about the routes not taken. And I think that's key to understanding the relationship between history and the future. And the conversation that we're trying to have, or we're going to have with Michael, and that we rehearsed last night over a glass of wine, was to do precisely with a city that Michael knows very well, but also a character that is a key person in this story. So, Rebecca, if I can ask you to over to you.
Yeah, okay, so here is the title page of a famous academic paper written by the statistician Colin Clark. Now, this is a statistician who's also an economic historian. It took a very, very long time frame. So this is history measured in millennia. And he was writing in 1958, that's the date of this paper. And it's part of a series of very simple statistical modelling exercises he did about trends in urbanisation and settlement and food production and transport And he compared multiple civilizations over spans of thousands of years. And he developed a law, the density distance rule. All cities in the modern period are tending to spread their density over a wider and wider area. And why? Because transport, which created the dense city in the 19th century, is destroying it in the 20th century. So writing in 1958, this is one of the key papers which demonstrated the inevitability of total motorization, the death of the compact city, the death of face-to-face interaction in the city, and the dispersal of population over extensive areas. One of the people who cited this paper very often was my doctoral supervisor, Peter Hall, Carlos has just mentioned. Peter Hall, Professor Sir Peter Hall, who's one of the only academics I can think of who had a railway train named after them.
No.
The 5-car train set, number 378204, on the London Overground. It's a remarkable compliment to Peter Hall that he had this posthumous, it has to be said, he died the year before, the dedication of a train to his name. And this was the unveiling ceremony at Richmond Station in July last year. A great event. Now, why was it? It was because Peter Hall had actually conceived the London Overground. He conceived lots of things. He's actually, in his obituaries, attributed responsibility for the Docklands Enterprise Zone, for the M25, for HS1, for HS2, as well as for the London Overground. And in all of these projects, he was applying a different type of history. In a way, he rejected this early approach which he got from Colin Clark, a very modernist, a very 60s approach of planning for the death of cities and total motorization. He began to work, I should say, when I started with him, the first book he gave me was Herman Kahn, the year 2000. He was fascinated by futurology. He was an early contributor to the journal Futures, but he always applied a historical approach. And his historical approach led to a rejection of that initial pessimism about the city. He began to work on agglomeration economies, on the role of cities in creativity, on the extent to which economic cycles and cycles of technological change, particularly as represented by the Kondratiev long waves, originated in changes in dense urban environments of face-to-face interaction, such as the cities which had been created at high density by the 19th century invention of railways. So in the later part of his life, he became passionate about trains. And his book, London 2000, 1962, was all about a London which would be penetrated right, left and centre by urban motorways, and was illustrated with visions from the Buchanan report. But by the end, he was much more thinking in terms of methods of facilitating the city that would involve a return to rail. So one of the things that he helped to visualize and to bring to the drawing board and to, he didn't live to see it open, but he lived to see it started, was London Crossrail. So our third image here is, thank you Carlos, is a Liverpool Street station in London Crossrail, which illustrates two things. I mean, it illustrates this return to public transit, rail, cycling, pedestrian-friendly streets, reallocation of road space, which is so characteristic of European cities and hopefully American cities at the turn of the 21st century. And it also illustrates a different timescale of historical learning and historical shaping of the future. And that's part of the story of London Crossrail is the failure of a Crossrail build in 1994, because it was engineer-led, dominated by putting in the infrastructure, designing stations, and insufficiently sensitive to the city into which this mighty engineering project, Crossrail, joining up the through railways through London, a dream since the 19th century, how this was going to be inserted into London. So the Crossrail build went through in the late 20th century and is now being almost completed, is going to open next year, is a very remarkable demonstration of a macro project as micro-surgery, as keyhole surgery. So look at this is a railway station which is going to be carrying tens of thousands of passengers, trains which are almost a quarter of a kilometre long, arriving at a frequency of 2-minute head time. Every 2 minutes, there's massive trains coming direct from Heathrow, direct from the West Country, crossing the platforms at Reading, direct from Kent and London Docklands and South Essex. And yet, when they arrive at Liverpool Street, we see how the mighty flows of passengers are being channeled into rat hole entrances. One of them coming up in the forecourt of Liverpool Street Station, the other coming up into the ground floor of a single block, a single building at Moorgate.
Could I interrupt you just?
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, no, you're perfectly on time.
Okay, go ahead.
I have my watch here.
Okay.
It's my watch.
I think one of the things that I'm taking out of this fascinating, I guess, tracing a development of a line like this through individual characters, someone like Peter, but also through influential articles like Colin Clark's and ways of thinking more than anything else. Because you train as a historian, you've been a geographer as well, and a planner, you work in Crossrail and so on and so forth. Could you tell us a bit about the different sets of skills that you can draw on when actually entering discussions where the dominant language, for example, may be the language of the engineers, or in a different meeting, the dominating language is going to be the language of the capitalists, the people with money. Or if you enter a conversation with the local council is going to have very specific concerns about, for example, affordable housing and so on.
Yeah.
So do you think the more skills that we actually as individuals bring into the table, the better place we are to actually be able to inform decisions in a way that actually acknowledges the rules of the past, but also the limited visions of the future?
Well, all planning, all urbanism, all city design is about anticipation. And the techniques that planners use are intrinsically anticipatory. And they have to use both sides of the brain 1 and brain 2. So there's a lot of plan tech, which is all to do with modelling. It involves logical positivism, it involves numerical modelling, it involves understanding data series and ability to capture data, to model it and to roll it forward. That's very, very important. And the other is a historical imagination which is much more dialectical, which understands that preferences can change very radically within the space of not only a generation, but in the space of the fashion cycle, which is an annual cycle pretty well. And these two things, and I mean, anybody who works with designers knows that visualization, realization of models and computer virtual reality environments and maquettes and written prose, I mean, language, all of these things matter to bring to the consumer, or the public, the sense of what the future could be, which is not necessarily apparent. And I mean, the amazing thing about town planning, which was Peter's field, and is mine, is the rapidity with which things can change. And I think, from 1950s, when Colin Clark wrote, universal car ownership will come sooner or later, and the prudent planner must make his plans accordingly. And this meant building those urban motorways and planning for decentralization. And the change of that to the reallocation of road space we see in our great Paris, London, New York today is fantastic.
Do we still have time? Or do you want to open it to this?
Are you bored?
No, I'm not sure. I'm just conscious of the time, but that's fine. I can carry on, that's fine.
Maybe just one
Couple of minutes.
last, yeah.
Okay. I had the privilege to meet Peter. This about, I think it was 4 years ago. I organized a conference here in the Senate House in collaboration with the London Transport Museum. And this was to mark the anniversary, the 150 years of the opening of the first section of the Metropolitan Railway. And Michael was the closing plenary speaker, and we stayed in touch ever since. But one thing that I took from the very short exchange with Peter is two things. One is to do with sensitivity to different cultures. He lived in different countries, he spoke different languages, but similarly, when you actually deal with subjects like this, which is perhaps like art, engineering, perhaps like the numbers, the stats, the calculations, they have to be in place. But effectively, cities are actually about people. And so he would always place people before anything else. Mm-hmm. And that is something that sometimes when you read reports by, for example, the Foresight report by the government on infrastructure, or even the infrastructure plan for London 2050, it's really hard to pin down where these people and who these people are. Did you have any reactions or comments?
No, I think it's an extremely valid point that it's the two sides of the brain again. And I think what's interesting in Peter Hall's work, which by the way is 53 or 54 books and thousands of articles, he was an extremely prolific writer. But over time he became more and more interested in the role of utopias as vehicles for thinking about the future and the history of utopias, and for example utopias such as the Garden City. His final book that he published in his last year, Social City, was a combination of going back to late Victorian utopianism, Henry George, Edward Bellamy, Ebenezer Howard, and a completely contemporary look at the European urban system facing the challenge of sustainability in the early 21st century. And I think it's an interesting answer to your question, that as well as the abilities to visualize and to handle data, a novelistic, to complete the loop, ability to write science fiction is a useful door into possible futures.
That's a wonderful place to bring our conversations full circle. Thank you very much. I think what I'd like to do is just see if I can pull another line through everything that we've heard so far. So we had the idea of storytelling, which Pete set up really nicely for us, and I think everybody's engaged with that idea of storytelling and how that helps us in all sorts of different walks of life think about the future. The other thing that I thought was coming very strongly from all of your conversations was this idea of a time lag, that there is some that you in each different context you have to reckon with some kind of a time lag. So the 18 years co-housing between the glimmer of the idea and the realisation, that was the kind of the first really stark figure we heard, but actually it looked like nothing when we heard about Crossrail, which had a failed attempt in 1994 and is only going to come to fruition in 2018, and I wouldn't be surprised if actually that can be traced further back into the past as well. The glimmer of the idea probably goes way further back. And then I thought it was really interesting from Pete's talking about how his novels came about, that he had this idea of the high-ranking black police officer and it just wouldn't be plausible, so he had to boot it into the future. So there's that time lag that he was able to, or kind of had to use, sort of some form of science fiction or future-focused writing for. And then we had the feedback loop on the financial decisions, that you don't often actually really know whether it was the right decision or not until some time has passed, whether it's going to, I think your point was that it's a significant amount of time. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that how much have we really reckoned with when we think about visions of the future or different kinds of futures. Are we really attuned to that time lag, and what, maybe I could ask our practitioners to just think about anything that comes to mind, having heard other fields, other concerns about dealing with the time lag.
I think there are two sorts of time limits. One is just the physical time it takes to get something built, which is kind of long and much longer than perhaps, which is something you have to build into that. But what you're also creating in that process is the capacity to deal with time and manage what's going to happen in the future, which is a whole other thinking about and I think we have to worry more about the second thing than the first. First thing is just kind of technical. And I'm just kind of, a bit of my experience was working for government generation agency in Tripartite, which is managing the Millennium Communities program. Now kind of vanished into history, frankly. And it was a kind of brave attempt by a very passionate Secretary of State to try and get the house building industry to create more, better designed, more lively social places. It was completely the wrong medium through which to do it, because house builders, what we discovered was that only one of about 8 house builders had any R&D capability actually. So how were they supposed to develop new products and new ideas? And essentially it wasn't about the bricks and mortar, it was about who was going to live there, how they were going to live. And so without actually being able to engage them, engage the demand side, you're not building any future kind of resilience or capacity to be adaptive. And they're just kind of very ordinary places. Very special and they're sort of out of date, they're obsolete, almost before they begin.
If I could pick up on that, because I think one of the strongest elements of good decision making is the notion of how you go about the planning process, and both of you mentioned planning a lot. And that thing you just mentioned of adaptability is vitally important. And there are all sorts of examples where, well, if I just take a corporate world, typically you create a strategic plan for a company. And the CEO will judge your strategic plan to be good or bad, normally based on how detailed the plan is. So the more lines it's got in the Excel spreadsheet, the more stakeholder checkpoints, the more KPIs, the better the plan. But really, simply, the more detailed your plan is, the sooner it's going to start deviating from reality, because reality changes and circumstances change. And some organizations that have had hundreds of years of experimentation to deal with this problem are the military organizations, who, of course, have planning processes that internalize this notion that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But in all planning processes, no plan survives first contact with reality. You mentioned changing preferences, and they can change very fast fashions. But so does the political environment, so does the economic environment. And so my view of planning is important. And I can't remember who it was who said, plans are kind of completely unimportant, but planning is vital.
Almost every general you can ever
Yes. Multiply determined, yes. But if you're going to create a plan, the real problem with the planning is that not only do people do it in too much detail, but while they're doing it, they get emotionally invested in that plan. And by definition, the moment you turn that plan on and you push go, it is overfitted to your current knowledge base, and it is overfitted to the reality of the current world. And because you're emotionally connected, what you often find as plan and reality start deviating is people start making excuses for the plan, and they double up, and they double up. And so if you're going to create a plan, what is vital is that you not only create a plan, but you simultaneously create a process for how you are going to change that plan over time. You can think about this as a constitutional process. If countries write a constitution, it's there to ensure that there are certain things we don't wish to do, even if we're in a situation of crisis because they don't align to our principles. And a constitution, however, is not immutable. It can be changed, but it should only be changed more slowly than circumstances arise. So you should never change your constitution to shove through a single decision. Your constitution is only changed through a supermajority vote in 2 houses of parliament, etc. But the vital thing there is you have not only a set of rules or a plan, you have a set of rules and a plan plus a process for how to adjust it over time. And very often that second bit, certainly in finance and in the corporate world, that second bit is completely forgotten about. So people love their plan right up until the moment when they hate it. They turn it off, they fire someone, they go, we never do that this way these days, and then they rinse and repeat.
Emily, could I ask you to just channel Pete?
I'll do my very best.
Because I was just struck while Graham was talking that you talk quite against the emotional identification, Greg, that goes on, but yet Pete was talking about precisely the need to have empathy with the characters, and his point about world making, that early science fiction made these brilliant worlds, but their characters were flat, and the readers couldn't empathise with the characters. And he made the same point about thrillers.
Just a quick one, because I don't wish to sound in any way that I'm against emotion.
Yeah.
There's all this wonderful literature from psychology that there are people who are genuinely unable to experience emotion because they've got frontal lobe damage in certain ways. And far from emotionless people becoming better decision makers, they can become absolutely, well, they can't make decisions. Because if you have no way of attaching emotion to future states of the world, you have no basis on which to make a decision. So you sort of swim around going, well, I don't really care about everything. So.
Absolutely, yeah. And that is actually one of the points that Pete made in our conversations. Obviously, that was a longer conversation to edit it down. Is the thriller, in a way, invests in this idea of there being, something better. And it's an emotional investment, absolutely. And his point was that, what would the nihilist novel look like? It certainly wouldn't be a thriller with that idea that it would be there would be a future world that might be worth making changes for and making transformations for. But I wanted to say a couple of things about the question of the time lag. You were speaking. We've been talking about the ways in which it took 18 years for this particular housing project to actually come into fruition, and time lags on various kind of forms and ways. And it reminded me very much of what in literary studies would be called the avant-garde, a particular period or genre. And the idea that there are some forerunners of style, taste, genre, experimenting and pushing things forward, and at that time the wider cultural context is often alienated by whatever development it might be. And modernism is one perfect example where Ulysses was greeted with moral outrage at the time that it was published, and it's only then later, after this timeline, that the creative practitioners like Joyce, Joyce in particular, if you're thinking about modernism, like Woolf, are recognised as having made fantastical transformations to the future of that particular cultural practice, in that case, literary scholarship. So there is a sense, I think, that those forerunners of the avant-garde are often vilified in their own time, but actually, unbeknownst to them, often, it can take a long time, but they have often changed the broader cultural context and that particular field in ways that are probably not tangible to them at the time, but they were necessary. Their interventions were in many ways necessary for that sort of broader sea change to occur.
I wonder what we take from that, because the other kind of thread that I had that was running through things was this idea of destabilising, that human creativity, very broadly defined, destabilises, and this becomes inherently political. I think that was your point, that the alternative models that then challenge the...
And those models feel very threatened, even though they're much more powerful.
Yeah.
Very politically powerful, financially powerful. They feel deeply threatened by the one who do things for themselves.
So I'm just wondering how you turn that into some kind of positive sense of how do you know you're doing the right thing for the future? Is it that you're in the political hotlands, as it were, and things are getting tricky around you, but you wanted to come in, Michael?
Well, on time lags. I'm not sure about the concept of time lag. It's rather like driving a dodgy old vehicle with spongy brakes. I mean, the concept of time lag implies that if you keep pressing the brake pedal long enough, sooner or later it'll connect. But think of the nightmare scenario in which you press the brake pedal and you keep pressing the brake pedal and it doesn't connect, and you run into disaster. I mean, I think it's a missing key question, maybe. that take climate change. We've known about climate change as a reality and global warming. We've known since the 1960s. The Intergovernmental Commission has been meeting since the 1990s. All of us involved in environmental research thought it was a time lag problem, that sooner or later the penny would drop. But since the last American election, I mean, the most frightening aspect has been realizing the penny's not going to drop. The brakes aren't going to connect. Our ability to anticipate is faulty. So the Cassandra factor is missing, I think, in this scenario.
Does anybody want to help us out of our extremely depressed end?
I suppose I would just say I'm not sure that it's there's a lack of care. I mean, who cares? There are some people who simply do not care that certain things are going to happen. They may be able to anticipate it. The question is they don't feel responsible for it, they don't feel connected to it. So I don't think it's just, we can't load it all onto our anticipatory capacity. Some of this is other stuff. Some of this is disconnections of a whole, sorry.
I would say that, and that's precisely Pete's point, that one of the things that he does, and sees it very, very consciously in his own work, is trying to activate precisely that intersubjective empathic encounter between the reader or the consumer of whatever piece of creative work it might be, and an imaginary other, right? So to develop that kind of empathic capacity.
And I just want to add something on that, and how Greg finished his discussion. Markets don't have to be amoral. You look at the whole asset management industry, nearing $100 trillion, and almost 10% of that is socially and environmentally responsible investment. So these people are actually investing in, for the climate change, to prevent climate change, and it is possible. And in that sense, markets don't have to prioritize efficiency all the time, and it's happening right now. Yeah.
But it's often, this morning in this very room, we were having a conversation precisely about responsibility and the responsible anticipation, I think it was the term used. And often that comes as a response to, for example, the UN estimates about the global population growing rapidly, so that by 2050 you will have 9.7 billion inhabitants. Between 60 to 17% of those living in cities. And the majority of the growth between now and 2050 concentrated in Africa. So of course that's a doom scenario. But actually, when you take the long perspective, if you read archaeology, you realize that actually one of the things that there's a wonderful article published in the 1950s by Gordon Child, which is called the Urban Revolution. And he looks at 4 different Asian cities. And the key word for him is solidarity. It's actually not the houses, it's solidarity. It's people coming together. So if actually people come together to cities and make a living in cities, then exactly the same prediction can be understood in a completely different way. And I think I guess part of our responsibility is precisely to diversify those stories.
I think we've got time for just one more question. Yeah.
Well, there were conversations across 4 different domains, each of which are moving kind of forward into different futures of transportation, of housing development, of literary markets. So on the others, to what extent, though, are some of these larger forces that have just come up in the summary being considered in this planning discussion? So climate change wasn't mentioned until we had this kind of common discussion. Kind of post-capitalism wasn't mentioned by Greg, or kind of, perhaps, significant dislocation in connected markets in the future. So how are we, and I think this could be a positive direction. So, as I'm working with climate change planning with municipalities myself, and using foresight methods, they're seeing this as very positive. So in what ways I guess I wanted to ask the panel, in what ways are you introducing kind of these larger dislocating forces that need to be considered in perhaps nearer futures than we would like?
I mean, just one quick response to this. I mean, the climate change thing is fascinating from a decision science angle, because when I talk about that dislocation between the right answer and the comfortable answer. The comfortable answer for a lot of people now is, well, this climate change thing is kind of, it's complex, it's frightening, and it's a long time in the future. So why engage? And trying to narrow that gap between comfortable and right, I think this is one area. So, I mean, just as an example, I've been doing quite a lot of work in the last 3 years on this notion of impact investing and how you get people to start seeing their social preferences as their financial preferences as part of a collective whole, rather than what most people do when they're faced with a complex problem, is we compartmentalize and we go, well, if I want to do some social good with my wealth, then I'll give £8.50 a month to the Red Cross, assuage my social guilt, and I'll keep my financial portfolio as rapacious as possible because that's only about finance. And if we can find ways of helping people to see these things in bigger bubbles, as it were, we might start addressing that. That's just one small example, but I think there are
more holistic reasoning.
Now, I'm not going to say this is going to solve it, but there's certainly tendrils reaching out.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I was going to say it then, I'm not having any of this pessimistic stuff. Because, I mean, we've already seen the reaction to Trump's city come out of Paris Agreement is actually there are cities and communities and states and companies who actually really want to do something about it. And so they are doing something. It's not just about thumbing their nose to Trump. And I think in the kind of the urban planning realm, I wouldn't say I'm an anti-planner, but I'm an anti-rational planner. Because I think what you see in community housing is people have got a very clear idea of how they can live differently. With help, they can realise that. Or they may only be doing it on kind of small scale, but that's actually how cities work. Cities are fractal structures. Lots of self-similar pieces. You get enough of them. And if anybody knows Arlo Guthrie's Alice's Restaurant, if you get enough people doing it, people will think it's a movement and you change the world.
Let's end on that note.
We are addressing the question of what the role is of the past and what our relationship to it might be in anticipating the future. So that's kind of where we're focusing quite heavily on the ideas from the past and how to reconceptualize this. And our session structure is quite simple, really. We were going to have 5 short talks, but unfortunately at the last minute one of our presenters couldn't make it. So we're going to, the person who's not here is Annalisa Tota from the University of Rome. So we've shifted our timing around a little bit. I'm going to talk for 10 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Robin, who will speak for 20, then to Anne, who will speak for 20, and I'll close with another short 10-minute presentation. My final one might not be as long as that. So in these 4 short papers, we're going to focus on the way in which the past is dealt with in a variety of public anticipatory practices, which underpin democratic forms of being, both in human social systems and in an ecological sense. And the 4 of us have approached this theme from quite different perspectives. My own approach is both philosophical, or epistemological, and educational. So in the first part, I'm going to introduce a couple of epistemological, philosophical ideas, which I'll then follow up in my last closing presentation to show how those kind of might translate into an understanding of education, although that understanding is quite intuitive at this point. So that's our structure. The common themes, because we're dealing with anticipation in quite different ways, we have got a common theme in that what underpins our independent work is the insistence on bringing the past, the present and the future into dialogue with each other. Or, as Robert suggested, more accurately, recognizing the ways in which others do this in all sorts of anticipatory projects. Now in this first part, I want to try to unsettle an understanding of anticipation that is so dominant in contemporary Western society, and I've been hearing it in a lot of the presentations I've been to so far, as to be considered unavoidable and even natural. And this dominant understanding of anticipation is linked to the notion of extrapolatory envisioning, where the past is seen as a resource for deciding on the most responsible actions to take in the future. I want to suggest that this is a deterministic form of anticipation, and it is not the only option available to us. There is room for an alternate emergentist conception of anticipation, and for this reason I've entitled this first paper, Anticipation as Emergent Event. Now, extrapolatory envisioning holds a number of assumptions about how we should take responsibility for the future. And I would call that taking responsibility for the future. We could say it's anticipating responsibility, as opposed to a backward-looking responsibility, like taking responsibility for the actions that have already happened. This is a future-oriented form. Now, regardless of whether such responsibility is understood as morally or politically motivated, one underpinning assumption is that responsibility or responsible action is primarily about the capacity to form the correct or the best action in an anticipated future scenario. Now, to perform such correct actions, it is also assumed to be necessary to anticipate possible futures by projecting, extending, or expanding known experience into areas not known or previously experienced, to determine what can or should and what cannot or should not be done. And therefore, a third assumption is that responsible action is assumed to be a function of envisioning. We envision possible alternatives, and then we rationally choose the best one from amongst those that present themselves as possible. Now, this understanding of responsibility, although it's really important in many of our human affairs, it's also highly problematic in contemporary multicultural and technological societies, where the best or most responsible alternative can invariably be understood as culturally mediated. Furthermore, and this is what is particularly interesting to me, is that these three assumptions themselves rest on the assumption of mechanistic causal continuity, both in an epistemological knowledge sense and an ontological or process sense, between past, present, and future. Which means, in the modern Western world, correct or responsible human action has been understood to be a product of human ability to extrapolate. We are supposed to be capable of anticipating or envisioning or extrapolating possible futures and rationally choosing the morally or politically correct option. And it's this assumption I want to take issue with. First, many, if not all of us here in this room, are well aware that the assumption of mechanistic causal continuity between past, present, and future has been quite strongly challenged by authors such as Bergson, Mead, Prigogine, Complexity Science, Deleuze, and many others. Furthermore, there are influential notions in historiography which have drawn attention to the incommensurability between past and present knowledge. And the notion of strong emergence, and I've heard emergence mentioned quite a few times here already, has been helpful in understanding the radical challenge that such perspectives bring to mechanistic determinism. I've also written about this in a few of my own papers. So this raises the question of whether responsibility is necessarily extrapolatory. And I would argue that one more assumption, such insights have been brought together under this label of new materialism, which some of you may or may be aware of, authors such as Karen Harad, Kuhn and Frost, Dolphin and Fundamental, etc. So I want to suggest that these four challenges suggest that extrapolation does not provide the only way to conceptualize anticipatory responsibility. And this conclusion then raises the question of whether responsibility for the future can be understood as a function of some other non-extrapolatory conception of anticipation. And if that's true, then what would constitute a non-extrapolatory conception of anticipatory responsibility? And this is the big question. And actually, I haven't theorized this completely. My ideas in this regard are mostly intuitive, but it's a line of thinking that I've done in detail. So I would say, can the past ever be understood as something other than simply a technical resource, which we call knowledge, that can be used for higher order moral or political ends? Is there some other way of engaging with the past? Could the past be treated as something that has value in itself, like a living thing, rather than just a resource to be used? Can we remember it and do, love it even no matter how traumatic that past might be? I'll continue this line of thinking ever so briefly in my final presentation on education, which I've developed more fully for Roberto Colli's Handbook of Anticipation. I brought a couple of copies of that paper here, if you want any of them. But before we get there, because I'll be presenting that last, I just want to hand over to Robin, who has further insights to add to this, not particularly problematic as I've raised it, but to our general problematic.
Thanks.
Let's look what is important.
Okay, I'll just look at my own and watch. So I want to talk about anticipation as rupture of events, and events is sort of the bailiwick that I've been circling around in my own work. So unanticipated events cause ruptures in our habitual ways of being in time and in the world. We rely upon the idea of the future, that the future is, as Deborah mentioned, to a large extent predictable and controllable, and that it will have some kind of family resemblance to the present or a modified variation on it. We'll see our workmates at our office, we'll have lunch at our usual spot, and so forth. From the mundane to the sublime, from the small scale to the large, we navigate through time and through space, leaning a lot on habit. But unanticipated events disrupt this world, and I'm interested in how people experience events with all of their startling powers to unhinge and amaze and disorient, and ultimately even to change our loyalties, our identities, our relationships, and our institutions. I'm also interested in how people wrestle with these ruptures to give them shape and give them direction. Forms and shapes and institutions and agents of various kinds rush in to give the rupture coherence and directionality. At the other end, all historical events are, I would claim, existentially unfinished, though they can appear to be closed or complete. Wars end, movements die out, traumatic conflicts are resolved. But there's always contestation and uncertainty over the boundaries of events. Human agents struggle to claim alternately that events are finished or they're still open and active. One sociological initiative, and not just in sociology, that somewhat, I think, unwittingly reproduces the common tendency to cauterize events analytically is that of memory studies. Many studies of collective memory assume that the events being commemorated and memorialized are finished. In this view, the memorials are not themselves actual elements of the event, but rather post facto supplements or embellishments. I would argue, actually, that memory studies in sociology has been a mechanism for smuggling events into a discipline that's typically more focused on long-term conditions and disinclined to focus on social ruptures and crystallizing moments. Memory studies, or collective memory studies, typically they concentrate on museums, monuments, and memorials. They manage to absorb the original precipitating events by declaring them finished. And they've done so largely by analyzing objects that anchor these events in space and in time. The monumental stones, the ruins, the memorials, the inquisitional hearings, and the commemorative ceremonies. I want to present a different point of view, that the memorial or the speech or the stone or the museum are actually only provisionally congealed moments of the events themselves. And they are always available to uncongealings. So in this rather short talk, I have two goals. One, I want to highlight the moments when the existential incompleteness of events is actually recognized. And then I also want to describe the mechanisms that I believe manage the pulsations of event formation, deformation, mobilization, and reformation. So I'm going to start with an example of an event appearance or reappearance that has occurred fairly recently. In the United States, there's been a controversy swirling around the statues of 19th century Civil War Confederate Army generals. I mean, literally swirling around the statues themselves in the form of encircling marches and the defacements of the statues and in the taking down of some of them. While some few will decry the defamation of, quote, our great heritage, that was Donald Trump on October 26, weighing in on the Virginia governor's race. He tweeted about the Republican candidate Ed Gillespie that, quote, he might even save our great statues and heritage, end quote. And the quote unquote honorable men that Chief of Staff John Kelly intoned about Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. So clearly these multiple acts of excoriating and exhorting or labeling or reviling or praising the statues of generals from the 19th century are part of a rupturing event of some kind. They have been accompanied by marches of white nationalists and violence that in Charlottesville, Virginia led to the killing of a young woman by a Nazi sympathizer. The political struggles around these statues include determining what event specifically they are a part of. Are they episodes of an apparently still galvanizing and alive civil war of the North versus the South? Are they parts of the extended traumatic event of slavery in the United States? Are they part of the mid to late 20th century civil rights movement in the United States? Or are they episodes of a resurgent anti-Semitic pogrom, now transplanted from Europe to the United States, or the Holocaust, with the marchers in Charlottesville, Virginia shouting, quote, Jews will not replace us, among other epithets. Part of the disorienting rupture of these recent actions involved the public alertness to the possibility that these historical events are not actually finished after all. And if these events are still ongoing and the past isn't past, it also requires, I think, a different way of thinking about both the present and the future. So it must be recognized that in cases like these, anticipation of the future vies with dread about the future. A past is publicly carried forward into the present and is understood to be capable of disturbing and destabilizing that present and any future. I'm arguing that analysts must take events seriously, even sociologists, and this means taking seriously our journeys with them from incomprehension to comprehension. Some ruptures seem self-evidently important, shaking us up immediately. Some may start in the periphery of our vision and then get drawn into the center of our field of vision. How are we brought to pay attention to experience a rupture as significant? And here is where I think the role of forms that are deployed by individuals and institutions is paramount. And the forms are myriad. They include declarations of emergency, or manifestos of revolution, or constitutions, or official reports, or the aforementioned memorials and monuments. And as institutions and individuals create and present these forms for event making, the world has to decide whether and how to receive the forms. As well, the chain reaction of event forms matter, as the forms they take create a relay flow, propelling the event forward in time and space. And this is where the second half of the kind of mechanisms of event form and flow making is what I'm going to focus on. So my contribution then here is to describe what I consider to be the mechanisms by which such forms and flows are created. And I call this tripartite mechanism political semiosis. It's comprised of three features: a performative feature, a demonstrative feature, and a representational feature. And I'm just going to briefly describe each of these in turn. The performatives. So events are mobilized by and constituted by speech acts or their performative equivalents. They materially change the social and/or political world, including the identity of actors, relationships, and relationships between actors and institutions. And the foundational analytical reference here that some of you may recognize is the theory of performative speech acts by the philosopher of language J.L. Austin, most notably in his book, How to Do Things with Words. Austin originally proposed that performative speech acts are those that change the social world through their utterance. And a typical example is the statement, "We find the defendant not guilty." I always like to say not guilty, just to be a little bit lyrical and optimistic in this, that's spoken by a jury foreman to the judge at the end of a trial. Further, the effectiveness of performative speech acts depend upon their uptake by social agents in structured and institutionalized, but essentially open and contingent social worlds. Thus, performatives always pivot on the forces of institutional rules and social conventions on one side, and the contingent actualities of uptake on the other. In eventful processes, great things can be at stake in performative uptake, including the identity and fate of individuals and collectivities, citizenship, nationality, rights, and obligation all hinge on such things as vows and oaths, judgments and surrenders, declarations and decrees. Demonstratives. This is the second of the mechanism. Much of the work of distinguishing proximities and distances to and from erupting events is done by what I'm calling the demonstratives. These terms, these gestures, these statements index and distinguish proximal and distal entities and relations. In English, for example, the words this, that, these, and those are demonstratives. They also include the features of speech like the pronouns I and you, and the adverbs of time and place, here, there, now and then, that are drawn from the linguistic repertoire of deictics. These are the elements of language that shift their referent according to who is uttering them at any given moment in any given communicative interaction. I say I during my turn of talk, and then you say I immediately after during your turn of talk, and we both know who we're talking about. The demonstrative feature calls attention to the fact that all events are situated, whether they are conversations or whether they are wars. And no event can occur outside of a context, even as that context is expanding or contracting. And demonstratives actively reconfigure contexts. They highlight our orientations within and toward situations. We can have lots of indexical misrecognitions. For example, nation states frequently assess their relationship of geographical proximities to strategic proximity as they map their nation's metaphorical network of allies, friends, partners, competitors, and so forth. So, for example, in the 9/11 Commission report, they wrote, quote, "To us, Afghanistan seemed very far away. To members of Al-Qaeda, America seemed very close. In a sense, they were more globalized than we were," end quote. Indexical features are, I would argue, especially powerful then in establishing and then disturbing the grounds from which events erupt, designating near and far, now and then, sooner and later, us and them, inside and outside. The final feature is representations, and this draws on the theory of mimesis and the circulatory power of the copy, reiterating an event or an identity across time and space. They're recruited for the enactment of the world-changing performatives that are participating in the dialectic that carries events forward through convention and contingency. Copies aim to stabilize and sediment the historical transition in the face of uncertainty, distance, and resistance. And it's very important to think about the way that events get named, and that the labeling of an event is a kind of a representational form that gives a certain kind of character to the event. Aesthetic genres such as narrative, drama, poetry, painting, photographs differently contain and construe time, space, action, and causality, and thus specifying the generic differences is central to the analysis of events that take shape through these forms. And the biggest argument here is events don't live anywhere else but in the forms that they take. And it's crucial that you never know in advance exactly how a given form will be taken up in the world. So here's a prime example. George W. Bush stated on September 12, 2001, "This is war." What kind of a statement is this? Is there a war that the statement recognizes? Thus, is it a representational act? Does the statement actually declare a war as president? Is this a way of declaring a war in a kind of performative sense? Or does the statement situate a war in time and space demonstratively? This action and not that action is war, and it's now and not then. So let me end by just returning briefly to the case at hand that I mentioned earlier to show how I think these mechanisms of the performative, demonstrative, and the representational can help us make sense of the unanticipated ruptures of events and the ways in which we begin to try to domesticate them and make them coherent. So, how did the Confederate War Statute controversy rely upon these political semiotic mechanisms? Well, first of all, the demonstratives reoriented attention to the statues. Statues that people would walk by or drive by and not even glance at for many, many years. So we are now reoriented toward them at the center of our vision rather than in the far periphery of our vision. The performatives, the declarations or exhortations recategorizing something as treasonous or transgressive, that the Confederate generals were engaged in treason and that they should not therefore be memorialized in the ways that they are in the center of towns and cities. That their actions were transgressive, undermining democratic principles of equality. So those declarations reformulate their identities if they're taken up. Finally, representational, the discussions of the nature of the statues and their genres. Are they mimetic? Are they allegorical? Are they about legacy or myth? Or are they political representations? So let me just end by saying that I think that ruptures derail and reroute anticipation by exposing the artifacts of history with a capital H. We periodize and we cauterize to make the past stay past and the future seem both predictable and open. But events are never entirely closed, and we need to recognize their power to return with a vengeance. Only in this way can we lever into them more effectively. Thank you.
Okay, I have to say it's a bit daunting given this at a conference with an audience of anticipation scholars and foresight practitioners. I'm used to talking to sociologists, and sociologists know very little about foresight or foresight practice. So apologies if some of the issues that I'm wrestling with and I'll talk about to you today seem obvious to you or are kind of explored from very different angles within your world. I really appreciate your input, as this is very much a work in progress. It's the book that I'm actively researching right now. So for those of us who study and engage in social change efforts, the future is both a puzzle and a challenge. It's a puzzle as an object of knowledge, since it hasn't happened yet. We punt it into the epistemologically tenuous realm of the imagination, and yet it permeates our lives in sociologically observable ways, in our expectations and in aspirations, in our institutional scaffoldings, and in our heuristics for decision making. So the future is present, one of the themes of the conference here, even if it doesn't always behave the way that we anticipate or we want. Now, it's also a challenge, the future is also a challenge for action, particularly for those of us concerned with problems of inequality, exclusion, and violence. If the goal of social change is to, in some ways, escape the present and to change expectations and teleologies and lines of actions, how do we do this? We do it at least in part by imagining different scenarios for action, scenarios, some of which we engage with scenarios that we fear, others that we hope for, some are somewhere in between. So my current research is focusing on scenario thinking as a tool for constructing multiple possible futures, particularly in interventions related to public problems, and in terms of the theme of today's panel, focus on public crisis, but I'm focusing more on kind of public problems more generally. And I take what I call a critical pragmatist theoretical approach, grounded in a sense of the experimentalism, building on John Dewey's idea of futures as rehearsals in imagination. But it's doing with some essentially attentive to relations of power and conflict. I argue that we need to understand these processes of future making through scenario thinking in the fields of political contention and constraint. My previous work has been on social movements. And we have to be attentive to both their mobilizing and their demobilizing effects. So it's just on a panel where we talked about how scenarios or stories, they both open or models. They open up possibilities for the future, and they also narrow them, they also close them down. And I'm not looking at quantitative modeling, more narrative scenarios, but they very much have that same kind of dual nature, opening up possibilities, but also narrowing them, and with implications for the kind of action, political interventions that come out of them. So for today, I want to focus on the question of to what degree scenario thinking can serve as a tool for the kind of non-extrapolatory envisioning that Deborah was talking about. And I'm just kind of experimenting with this idea. You can tell me if I'm a target, because I may not be, in terms of how you framed it. But I'm also going to raise the question of whether this kind of scenario thinking can adequately engage the problem of responsibility. I think there's some real problematics here with regard to responsibility. Okay, so in the book I'm working on now, I'm focusing on scenario planning as a civic intervention, or focusing particularly on, sometimes they're called civic scenarios, sometimes they're called public interest scenarios, the borderline between public, private, civic is kind of blurred and tenuous. This is what I'm discovering as I'm looking into these. There's a history from which the scenario methodology has moved from military and corporate venues into nonprofit and civil society interventions, but also at the same time not coming purely from the military or corporate world, but also drawing on critical strands, emancipatory, normative strands of future thinking coming from visioning methods, French perspectivism. I'm focusing in particular on participatory methods that include both public dialogues, such as the ones focusing on transitions out of violent conflict, the famous classic ones, Montfleur in South Africa, Justine in Colombia, have to do with the Peace Accord process in Colombia in '96. So some are like some of the famous ones, but other ones, oriented towards peace building, and others that are focusing more broadly on issues related to democracy, development, peace building, climate change, wide range of issues that they're engaging, but kind of focused on issues that are framed as public problems that need to be some kind of broad social intervention. And in the broader project, one of the questions is to what extent these are venues, are Deweyan democratic venues for public debate and critique, or to what extent these are kind of Foucauldian mechanisms of public legitimation and control. And I think there's a tension there. And I think there's a possibility for both. And that's where I think you have to actually really look at the specifics of what is going on in particular scenario processes. So part of what I'm trying to do is actually gather lots of them and to look through their origins and their processes and their social interventions. Then one of the questions, just trying to understand the self-understanding of scenario processes, it presents itself as a cultural technology for what we call in sociology kind of unsettled times. So I think that there's a kind of very pragmatist and constructivist epistemology, at least for some of the more qualitative narrative framings. Scenario methods generally will position themselves between positive forecasting. They say, well, we're not looking at what will happen, and we're also not doing normalization. We're not looking at what should happen. Instead, we're looking at multiple possibilities for what could happen. And these kind of play on these modal verbs becomes a key form of distinction within the field. Not will, not should, what could happen. They kind of repeats again and again in the scenario literature. There's strong attention to uncertainty, contingency, nonlinear causality. So they really don't argue that what they're not doing is what Deborah was talking about in terms of linear causal reasoning. They're very attentive to nonlinear causal processes. They also put a very strong stress on relational learning, the incorporation of contending perspectives. And the claim is that they are especially suited for tuning conditions, to quote the directors of the Oxford Scenario program in our recent statement, conditions that are turbulent, uncertain, novel, and ambiguous. Or that is, which is what they are trying to do, or at least what they say that they're trying to do, is carry out anticipation in conditions of strong emergence. So this is one of the most recent statements of some of the core scenario practitioners, pretty close by. How does that work? How are they trying to engage with uncertainty, ambiguity, novelty, and turbulence? Well, the classic scenario, most of you are familiar with this, although, again, sociology knows very little about this process, but the classic two-axis model coming out of Royal Dutch Shell is that you identify the driving forces, some of which are understood to be inescapable, and this is the term that's used, but others of which are highly uncertain. You sort out the uncertainties, you rank the most relevant and the strongest uncertainties, and you put those on your axis of differentiation, and you use it to construct 4 different stories, and then you use these stories to evaluate different strategic pathways. There's lots of different methodologies for scenario analysis, for scenario construction, and in fact, the Oxford practitioners kind of will say, reject this as being overly deductive. They'll advocate a more intuitive logics approach that focus on stories that you've generated more inductively through conversation. But in any case, the argument here is that the uncertainties are the key scaffolding. The scaffolding upon which the scenarios are constructed are the key to how you build them. You build them by kind of maximizing the uncertainty in order to lay out the different parameters for the stories that you're telling, and to understand possible future contexts. So where is prediction in this? And I've now read dozens these, and they all have a statement that looks like this, every single one. So we'll say at some point, this is one that I'm going to talk about later in Kenya in 2000. A scenario is not a prediction. I guarantee you every single one will say this. We are not saying these things will happen. A scenario simply helps us to identify what might happen, what could happen. Scenarios are tools to bring out people's thoughts about what is happening, help them face different possibilities. These can be used to identify what needs to be done. So again, the framework that they're trying to understand is non-extrapolatory. They talk about challenging official futures and challenging preferred futures. They talk about trying to help people to see around corners. There's this kind of imagery, this is what you think we're seeing. Let's look around here. Let's put together these key uncertainties and see what else we wouldn't be able to see if we didn't look at this really carefully and put these various elements together. A lot of the scenario processes Jim Dater has analyzed these myths or archetypes that Carrie referred to earlier. Many of them, through a variety of methods, come up with scenarios that focus on growth or sometimes continuity, constraint, where you deal with some kinds of conditions that are going to constrain the process that you're on right now, a collapse scenario, and a transformation scenario. So again, what you're trying to do is not just look at linear causality, but to see around corners to try to anticipate a variety of plausible futures for what might happen. Now, a lot of this, if you're not doing prediction, then there's a strand of the scenario planning which focuses on not on trying to adapt to the situation or the problematic situation that you're about to transform it. And this is the way that it's described by another key practitioner, Adam Kahane, a famous scenario exercise in South Africa, the tradition of apartheid, in which members of the de Klerk government and the ANC, labor leaders and industrialists, civil society leaders, got together to develop 4 different stories, 3 of which are bad, 1 of which is good, and depending on whose account of these scenarios you believe, played a critical role in generating trust to lead you out of apartheid or steer the country towards austerity and neoliberalism with possibly negative economic repercussions for the situation that the country is in today. So these are some of the debates related to this kind of classic scenario exercise. But what I'm focusing here is Kahane's account on what he thinks he's doing. Again, not prediction. The purpose is to enable those of us who are trying to change the future collaboratively to transform rather than adapt. And the Shaw method is very much oriented towards adaptation. The situation that we are part of, we're transforming the situation like a caterpillar into a butterfly, rather than just doing only incremental or temporary change. Again, what we're not doing is predicting. We are changing understandings, relationships, intentions, and actions. With varying degrees, I think, of critical assessment of the status quo. Now here's another interesting scenario process carried out a little bit later by a group of sustainability-minded intellectuals that were kind of frustrated with some of the process coming out of the Rio '92 Earth Summit. Developed 6 different branching scenarios, didn't use the 2-axis method. This method was really targeted as a critique, I think, of the policy reform. They thought the policy reform is going to be inadequate to curb the devastations of neoliberalism and market forces. And they used quantitative modeling to kind of scope out all of these different scenarios. When policy reform fails to curb it, the world is going to plunge into crisis, breakdown of the richer part of the world will retreat into its fortress. Eventually, a citizens movement will emerge to carry out the great transition, which has more privatized and more public new paradigm versions. It's kind of deeply transformative vision, beautiful backcasting narrative that actually weaves its way through all 6 of these scenarios, but very oriented towards critique and intervention, trying to steer a whole kind of generation of activists towards a particular understanding of sustainable futures. Now here's another one which has a strong dose of critique. Actually, this is the first scenario process that I ever discovered, and so I've interviewed a number of the people who participated. This was the Kenyan youth scenarios carried out in 2010 by the think tank in Nairobi. They did participatory workshops with youth leaders in every region of the country, came up with very actually interesting regional differences, developed a scenario process that looked at whether youth had active participation or passive, and whether they attend to the growing inequalities relating from the youth bulge or they don't. The ocean scenario is a social democratic affirmative action, inclusive, engaging youth in the change process. Waterfalls, again, the more neoliberal, top-down, technocratic change. The youth are privatized in their personal self-advancement. Tsunami, they disattend to inequality, fielding a successionist movement from the marginalized regions that plunges the country into civil war. And the collapse is corruption. The country plunges into corruption, violence, stagnates. And once again, it's kind of two different variations on the disintegration collapse narrative. Very critical, very interesting narratives. Didn't go anywhere, actually sat on the shelf. In fact, I think perhaps because it was so critical, it was launched and then sat on a shelf and did not actually circulate. Although it was very transformative. I interviewed about 7 or 8 of the youth who participated, very transformative for many of the young people who participated in it. I now have collected about 100 of these. I'm going through them now, engaging issues related to democracy, disease, peace building, knowledge, climate. Issues related to who is funding them, who is included, what are the futures that are being mapped. Some are generated by the World Economic Forum, others by opposition intellectuals. Real range of these processes that I'm trying to sort through right now. But what I'm trying to get a hold on now, or what's the underlying theoretical orientation here? I think that they're based on an ontology, which I would call of expansive plausibility. So futures exist here as fictional constructions. Futures are multiple, they are open, but they're also grounded in observable patterns and trends and signals. So there are complex systems in the real world make some futures more plausible than others. So plausibility is critical here. But complexity dynamics makes them intrinsically unpredictable. So some futures are more plausible than others. So plausibility is where we get into the kind of ontological grounding in real world processes, but yet also inherently unpredictable. What's the epistemology? I would call it subversive constructivism. Futures can be known through an iterative, dialogic, and reflective process that circles between empirical analysis and imaginative storytelling. This helps us to disrupt mental models and see both possibility and also constraint. Interesting strong focus, I think, on constraint in these narratives. And a theory of action, which I would call robust consequentialism. By thinking hard and thinking together about problematic situations, we can feel, and this comes out of Shell, we can feel the consequences of different lines of action and thus develop more robust, flexible, and resilient ways of responding to whatever happens now and in the future. So again, kind of an emergencist understanding of how scenarios help us, how scenario thinking helps us to respond to whatever's happening in the future. So I want to kind of close by taking you through one particular scenario process that I looked at, looking at a little bit more depth. Another one carried out in Kenya by the same, one of the same think tanks, the Institute for Economic Affairs and the Society for International Development. Kind of modeled after Montpellier, although I think it was quite different in some of its composition. From Montpellier, young, forward-looking, mostly oppositional elites were instigating it. They included academics, civil society leaders, business, government. They got funding from a variety of international sources, but they did not allow any of the funders to participate in the process, and I think this was actually really critical for this particular process. They did extensive preliminary research and came up with this picture of now, which is very, very critical depiction of Kenya in crisis, political, economic, social crisis, in the country. In fact, they said that the first two workshops were focused on the picture of now. They fought and they fought and they fought about the contours of the picture of now. Then when they released it, they were amazed that no one ever questioned them about the picture of now because it was settled. But it was quite contentious, but they developed a quite critical picture of now. They arrived at 4 different stories, originally 3, but they came to 4, depending upon whether or not Kenya engaged in kind of high-growth economic policies, including public sector reform, privatization, investment in infrastructure and the knowledge economy, but without engaging in political reforms, political democratic, so kind of autocratic, repressive regime that invests in high growth, or in contrast, whether they engage in constitutional reforms focusing on human rights and social inclusion strategies, but do not engage in economic building. If they do neither, here there end up being lots of turbulence and uncertainty, but end up being poor but happy. Actually, they probably use those words, poor but happy. Or if they do neither, and the country plunges into ethnic and tribal conflict by not attending to inequality. Because in this scenario, there's happiness at the beginning, there's high growth, the economy booms, but then after a while, they're not attending to the inequality and marginalization, and conflict comes back to haunt them. This happens more quickly in the El Niño scenario, and they originally had these 3 scenarios. Their board told them they had a happy scenario. So they came up with the one in which visionary and bold leadership attends to both democratic reform and economic change at the same time, leading the country into the future, although everybody I talked to said that nobody believed in this scenario. So looking at this, I interviewed about a dozen people who participated. Things they valued, they really appreciated what they called this relational mixing. They talked to people they wouldn't have talked to. Other words, the political scientists had to talk to economists, who had to talk to artists, who had to talk to human rights activists. They appreciated the contention in points of view, the fact that they had to talk across these different divides. They agreed that the discussions was very contentious. They had intense disagreements and honest talk, fierce debates about plausibility, what stories were considered plausible or not. Some stories, they said, did not make it in because they were considered not tellable. So this becomes a really interesting question. How do you judge, depending on who's in the room, what stories are considered as being not tellable? They revisited tensions related from the colonial past. In fact, there were issues that were generated in some of the discussions that had to do with accusations of some of the defenders of some of this, let's say the economic growth scenario, as being associated with the home guard under colonial rule. So these simmering ethnic, tribal, colonial tensions came up in the conversation as well. They also said this was hard work. It's really hard to spin stories forward. This was only 15 years in time, which is the youth who are 20 years in time, and also having to reckon with limits to their own preferred scenarios. Which is what's interesting, the way that they talk about this is that each camp can find kind of a safe space to play forward their preferred scenario. So the Mendeleev camp, the industrialists, the economic leaders, can play forward this story of economic growth, but they can be challenged by the human rights activists and the social justice activists who said, well, wait a second, you're not taking into account what will happen when marginalization and ethnic tension is not dealt with. So that, this rise and then decline got written into the story. And the defenders of this path had to acknowledge that this story was plausible. And the same thing with the defenders of the democratization and human rights path also had to acknowledge that this would be a possibly turbulent and unstable pathway. So these plausible long-term consequences even of the stories that you like, have to be acknowledged, even if not necessarily acted upon. And here's where we're getting towards the question of responsibility. So why are so those are the core scenarios. What about these improbable scenarios? The catastrophe and the transformation stories. The El Nino story, the fact that nobody thought this was plausible because Kenya is not Rwanda, Kenya is not Somalia. But they said it was plausible. And the fact that they agreed that it was plausible, reinforced the commitment of the constitutional reformers to work for the democratization path. And in general, started to generate a consensus around the idea of socially inclusive development. The flying geese, even though it was an afterthought, it was described to me as a kind of the cleverest trick in the book because it kept the Mandaleo camp in the room, talking with the opposition activists, and kept them from shutting down the whole project. So it kind of helped to create a safe space for the opposition actors to generate their social critique. Now, what becomes interesting is that, in fact, Kenya did not pass a constitutional referendum in 2005, and 2 years later, the country does, in fact, descend, if not to an El Nino-like scenario of ethnic conflict and violence with people killed and displaced, at which point the scenarios kind of get revived in the press, and people say, well, wait a second, here was these thinkers who back in 2000 foresaw this possibility. They foresaw the possibility that if we did not attempt political reform, that this economic growth scenario would have a bad ending, and look, this is what happened, which gave some credibility to the process. So where is responsibility here? Come back to this question. I just discovered this really great, beautiful quote in this was a scenario for Europe, sponsored by the Economic Commission, that said, scenarios are by definition imaginary. If the authors have shown too much or too little imagination, they alone are responsible. Neither their views nor their perceptions must be taken to be those of the European Commission. I think that this kind of ambivalence about responsibility is sort of built into these scenarios, because what are scenarios? After all, it's just a story. So one of the facilitators of the Kenya went on to facilitate similar processes in Tanzania and Uganda and East Africa. And he described this process in Tanzania in which they developed, they were critiquing the union versus the federalist model, and the government said, wait a second, how can you criticize this? They're like, hey, it's just a story. And so the fact that it is just a story can be protective. It's in the safe space of the imagination. It can enable critique, it can kind of shelter critique, but at the same time it can enable disregard. Because if it's just a story, the industrialists can acknowledge the potentially negative effects of the Mandaleo scenario. It doesn't mean that they have to act on it, and in fact they did not. So in that sense, there's a consensus on plausibility. All the participants agreed that these endings were plausible, but it does not necessarily mean a shared commitment to lines of action coming out of the scenarios. And I found that this discourse of responsibility seems to be kind of notably absent from a lot of scenario literature. Not the visioning literature, but a lot of scenario literature just doesn't touch on it, just doesn't engage it. Which I didn't even notice until someone kind of pointed it out to me. They just don't engage the term of responsibility. So if you're opening up, you're also narrowing, but are you really paying attention to the consequences of those narrowings? So where is the past in this? The past comes up in a couple places and how they diagnose the problem. Post-colonial past, the tribal past, how they, in their theory of history, all four scenarios have a theory of history that starts with crisis generating a particular response to crisis. So there's a particular theory of change that they're working from. And yet within those theories, there are also competing theories, whether or not to the extent to which they prioritize economic growth, the economists versus the democracy theorists from political science, or the human rights activists, or the culture or humanistic artist types. A lot of them were focused on ethnic marginalization. these contending theories of history can be seen in their echoes in the stories. In the analogic reasoning, there's some shades of the past. Kenya is not Somalia, it's not Rwanda. Apparently, the discussion of whether or not South Africa was like Chile was very important in the Montfleur deliberations, according to Kahane, and also in the conversation. The fact that the historic justices, or the elephant of the room, having to do the legacy of the home rule, kind of erupted into the conversation, was like the eruption of the past into a conversation that was directed towards the future. Okay, so again, to close, what they understood themselves to be doing by engaging in this future-oriented exercise was engaging the unprecedented. And they say this several times in the report. They say that the challenge, this is a quote from the report, the challenge of these crises is beyond the resources of any single individual or tribal experience. The situation is unprecedented. There are no blueprints for handling it. Therefore, we will all make mistakes. No one can know in advance what will work and what will not. That is why we need to be willing to learn. So this kind of engagement of the unprecedented, the spirit of learning, the spirit of experimentation is there, even as they're trying to kind of map out these possible pathways. So I think we have to understand this as a very ambitious, compelling, kind of formative process of a group of intellectual elites who are trying to think the future of the nation. They were trying to be responsible, again, for the future of their country. There's kind of equal commitment here to facts and imagination. I think we could see that it was both critical and yet consensus seeking. I kind of understand this as like critical segment of civil society taken on the state and taken on the industrial elites and trying to rope them into their own consensus, not necessarily succeeding. And yet there's also like this echo of frustration that I heard in some of the interviews. They felt like they weren't adequately listened to, that the process that they experimented with was not institutionalized, and then now, once again, Kenya seems to be heading towards an El Nino type of scenario. So back again to this question of non-extrapolatory anticipation and the challenge of responsibility. I think that responsibility in these scenarios is ambivalent, kind of undesignated, and to some extent unresolved. In a sense, I don't know if it has to be that way. Actually, if people have insight into that, I'd love to hear it. So it ends with a figure of a Kenyan male elite looking at a set of crossroads, trying to decide where he should go. But the question of responsibility is tenuous. But it's up to us to do something. But what do we do? Well, I'm not really sure. So then the question then becomes, how do we link? These genuinely challenging and critical forms of non-extrapolatory anticipation to a sense of responsibility to a just, inclusive, and non-violent future. And with that, that sets you up.
I'm going to talk very, very briefly, just to close this down. I've got about 5 minutes, perhaps even less. I want to just quickly say something about anticipation as an educational event. And I know we don't have much time. And in the intro, I introduced the idea that extrapolatory anticipation, which is based on knowledge of past events, might not be the only way of taking responsibility for the future. Especially when we see a situation like this where we don't know how to deal with the unprecedented. And in this regard, I suggested it might be possible to see the past as something other than merely a technical resource that can be used for utilitarian ends. But what might that actually be? And I'm in the process of trying to theorize education as that intervention that enables us to work with the unprecedented in ways that do not simply use knowledge of the past to bring about some preconceived idea of what is good or right or proper. So it's not about, often people say we've learned lessons from the past and we will never do that again. And education is often conceived in that way, learning lessons. Well, when we've got something unprecedented to deal with, we can learn lessons from that, but it doesn't help us deal with the next unprecedented situation. So what is education's role in our dealing with the unprecedented? And I'm saying that in multicultural and technological societies, we've got a lot of unprecedented situations to deal with. One educational theorist I draw on quite a lot is Kurt Lister, and he describes what he calls a pedagogy of interruption, which is very interesting in terms of what Robin was saying as a rupture of events. He theorizes education as a rupture of events. And I'm going to leave it just at that, because I just want to open discussion about what education might be if we think about anticipation as a non-extrapolate, or responsibility as a necessarily extrapolatory anticipation. Thank you everyone for being here.